became an established betrothal at that point in time. He was 26 at the time. I was 14, just for context. The SA began fairly quickly. It seemed like once the relationship had been established, these words were being said. And I was a kid that just really wanted to fulfill God's will.
Notice the similarities and the patterns in the stories, and from people who don't know each other, their stories are unrelated. Why is there so many similarities? It's because predators have patterns.
They're grooming an entire community. And they were literally told by leadership not to question it. And I want to make this clear. There was no way that I could get out of this relationship. He had already established himself as, I hear from God, I'm God's spiritual authority here, and I'm the authority figure. I can't say no to any SA. Really, I have no voice, right? Through this whole betrothal, I have no voice. Certainly Morningstar was consulted on this. So for anyone to come back and say, oh, you just have a vendetta against Morningstar. No, understand we gave our lives.
At that point, there's no spiritual process to work through. There's like, I need to call the authority.
Right. I learned very quickly, like, oh, I can't talk about this relationship. It's when you continue to make the same decision over and over again, where God's not going to remove my mantle because I didn't cross this line. That's not God's grace.
Right.
Leaders and people that haven't been doing right, there needs to be a making it right factor.
So many people need to wake up and listen and pay attention to these stories, because we have an obligation to keep future generations safe. And it's on us. We can't always rely on the criminal justice system. Why didn't you ask me if anything had happened? Nobody asked me the question of, did he ever cross the line?
Morningstar has under its belt 2 youth leaders who were convicted of being offenders against kids.
Who does that? Who says, I'm aware that there actually is SA here, and yet we're going to not say anything. We're going to cover our brother and let him go do this somewhere else. By not saying something, by not speaking up, I am culpable. Someone else is harmed. Part of that responsibility is on me. In fact, predators typically go on to perpetuate and continue to abuse. That's when I was like, I have to come forward. I have to say something, because I had this realization, like, I've been silent for 2 decades. What has happened? And this is why I come on and have these conversations, and why I'm willing to publicly speak about what happened to me. It is not easy, but it's because I want other people to be safe.
And seeking accountability and for change to happen. If that's what they call demonic, we're not reading the same Bible. This should cause people to pause. If people don't see that there is a systemic problem of platforming predators at Morningstar, it's because they don't want to see and they're blind.
It's so impactful, and you guys are truth tellers.
Hey guys, today we're going to be hearing from a courageous woman named Sarah Carr. She's going to be sharing her story, how as a young girl, her former youth pastor at a Morningstar Fellowship Church used prophecy to groom her, SA her, and convince the church that God said she was to be his wife. Her perpetrator, David Fenton, was convicted just a few weeks ago. Any of you out there that have been following along with the Morningstar storyline will likely realize they now have 5 lawsuits pending against them, and a host of other abuse allegations, first-hand accounts coming to light. Despite all this, Rick Joyner takes no accountability for harm that's been caused in his church and other ministries under him, and he continues to platform predators on the scale of ones like Todd Bentley, who are so obvious. My wife Erica will be joining us today in our conversation. Some of you might remember her from our interview with Leah a few months back now, where Leah had shared her own encounter with SA while a student at Morningstar and the egregious behavior of the leaders. Leah and Erica were both students together at Morningstar University. Sarah has a powerful testimony as well as real words of wisdom for all of us in the midst of this massive house cleaning in the church and exposing of predators right now. I find her story further affirms that Rick Joyner has a proven track record of being grossly negligent as a leader of a major ministry, claiming to bring accountability to many other ministries, as we'll learn about today. As with so many of these horrific stories of abuse, leadership knew and did nothing to help the victim or help safeguard other sons and daughters from being harmed as well. Nor did they take any actions to bring justice and accountability to the perpetrator. There's a lot to unpack in this video, but I do hope you guys will stick with us. Her story is well worth the listen. Also, I put a chapter marker about halfway in the conversation if you guys need to come back. I understand. But please do help me in supporting this survivor today by giving a listening ear to her heart and story.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today, for giving us your time, and for sharing your story with us. I know it takes courage to do what you're doing right now and to be willing to share a very hard and very vulnerable place of your life. So I just thank you for so much for coming and speaking with us. I know you've shared some before too, your story with others, but I feel like you have such a powerful testimony. I think the church needs to hear voices like yours right now. And just for other people, a quick preface on how I got connected with Sarah. When news of the lawsuits came out last August? Yeah, last August, of the youth boys from Morningstar who were being essayed for multiple years by the youth leader. I honestly I felt so compelled to speak. I have adolescent boys. I was a part of the SF program in Morningstar. And I just, knowing what I knew happened when I was a student there, essay that happened to my friends, I wanted to speak up. And so we released a video then, and Sarah actually saw it and reached out to us and thanked us for the video and then shared her story. So we got connected with her. And since that, Sarah has actually had a major victory in her case with her abuser having been convicted, and he pled guilty.
He did. He pled guilty. Yeah, which is an incredible experience to hear him actually
Acknowledge
admit
that
in court.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I understand he's now awaiting sentencing. But before we get into that aspect of kind of getting to filing your case and his arrest and conviction, I wanted to just rewind back and let people hear how this started for you, how you met David Fenton, and how this process of grooming and abuse began.
My goodness, yeah, there's a lot to that. So yeah, to set some context for you, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania my dad was a pastor at a small family church. And then in the mid-90s, a lot of the revival things were happening, Metro Vineyard, there's Rodney Howard Brown revival in Florida. And so our church was really, and we were as a family, really longing and drawn to a lot of that charismatic movement where it felt fresh and it felt alive and just really charged, right? With God moving in new and incredible ways. And we wanted to be part of that. So our family ended up folding into Abide in the Vine, which was a church in Owego, New York. And Abide in the Vine was part of and was forming a relationship with Morningstar. And look, we went down to Morningstar conferences, we participated, we had Morningstar leaders coming up and sharing and speaking. And it was just a really time of kind of that movement, those early movement. And I met David because he was the youth pastor. Pastor Dave was youth pastor, worship leader, and then he also did a lot of prophesying in the church. So we had Pastor Fred and Donna Hoover, who were head pastor, and then Pastor Dave was kind of right there underneath that. Our family had not been part of that church for very long when he began spending a lot of time with my family. And part of it could have been that initially we had a lot of youth, my dad having been a pastor, there's a lot of people that were always in and out of our house. Pastors' houses get kind of busy and full of things. And so he would spend a lot of time. Looking back on it now, I think that there was a reason to why he was spending so much time at, my parents' house, establishing, who he was and gaining favor with them and becoming, this trusted person in our lives. And so he spent a lot of time. He also would engage with, my siblings. I'm one of four, and we always had lots of kids in the house. And we even had other youth leaders that lived close by that they would come up and spend time and have dinners together and stuff. So there's a lot of activity, but he did spend quite a bit of time having conversations with us. Now I can see it where he zeroed in on me a little bit more, spending more time with me, getting to know my thoughts or, a little history about my life. And I remember having a dream. In fact, I can still picture it very distinctly today, where he was proposing to me at my family's pond, and that's what this dream was. And I remember waking up, and I remember thinking, oh my God, what was that? What the what? And I just had this feeling of that felt like it kind of came out of nowhere. Like, this is not something that I was pursuing or wanting. Like, in fact, I had a crush on someone else in our youth group, very much so. And I was just like, okay, so I just wrote it down and I kind of just hid it away and was like, I'll deal with that later. I'll figure this out later. And in the meantime, he had been over like maybe a week or two later, having conversation with my mom. And I remember them talking in code to some extent. And I remember thinking, I know what they're talking about. And so I called it out and I said, I know what you guys are talking about. It sounds like you guys are talking about this idea that, I'm supposed to marry, Pastor Dave, or that we're supposed to get married. And they're like, yeah, that is, and Pastor Dave had, and I don't remember how many dreams or visions he had, or what he was saying that he had. I remember one being specific about that he had been searching for a wife and talking to God about that, and asking God why he hadn't had a wife yet, because he was 26 at the time. I was 14, just for context. And he had said that God had shown him, all the qualities that he was looking for, and he apparently had told God that I embodied these qualities and virtues of what he was wanting in a spouse. And God had told him, well, don't you think that you are worthy of the measuring stick? Meaning me being the measuring stick. And therefore God was giving him me as his wife and promising me to him. And so all of these, and there were other dreams, visions, and, within the church, I felt like my dad thought that he had heard, a word of God about that. So there's a lot of and that was kind of the culture, right, of that time. Was there was a lot of prophesying. There was a lot of different, word of knowledge, dreams, visions, things like that happening. And it wasn't a secret. It was brought, before the church elders as kind of more of this conversation kept happening. And it became an established relationship. So it became an established betrothal at that point in time. And it felt, and I'll be honest, I 100% was convinced, right, that this is what God was showing. I had that dream. I have another interpretation of that now, but at the time, right, I had this dream. These words were being said, and I was a kid that just really wanted to fulfill God's will, right? I wanted nothing more than to be at the center of God's will, to fulfill my purpose, to fulfill my destiny, to walk in that ministry. And that's what I thought, this is what God was saying. And any time I had concerns or fears or doubts where I, like that gut feeling that was like, oh, this doesn't feel right, or something feels off, it was like quickly shut down. And he had gained access to me pretty quick. I mean, he had always had access to me, right? Like by coming to our house weekly. By this time he was calling me every day practically, And so if I expressed any concerns or worries or fears or doubts, he was quick to say, that's the enemy. That is the enemy attacking. This is confirmation, right? That this is the will of God, because the enemy wants to fight so hard against, the will of God. And so I was like, okay. And anytime I doubted, it was, aren't you strong enough, Sarah, to fulfill God's will? Don't you want to fulfill God's purpose through your life? And every time, right, I'm like, yes, 100% I want to. I will lay down my life. I will sacrifice. I will pick up my cross and I will follow Jesus. If that's, marrying you, then yes, I'm committed to this relationship. And so by the time the relationship was fairly well established, which happened, I want to say like there was like several months of kind of grooming of establishing like the trustworthiness. And then by the time the prophetic words, right, came out and this was it, there was probably a few more months of really establishing that and fighting hard for, this is what God wants. Your destiny, your purpose is to marry this man. And he had given me a promise ring at that point in time as well. So he worked, I want to say, pretty fast at establishing this relationship within a matter of months. And my recollection of that, I was not privy to conversations, right, with church leadership, but it wasn't a secret, right? The church knew about this relationship. The youth group knew about this relationship. Everyone, it seemed like, was aware that this relationship had been established. I wasn't part of those conversations as far as what the elders felt like they had came out later in the investigation, that there had been parameters that were established. I didn't know about those parameters, mainly because we already had like this flow of how we interacted with each other, and I didn't see any change. He still called me, he still came and saw me. We weren't allowed to go on dates. We had to have like chaperones, those kinds of things. But he still came to my house regularly and spent time with me. I went to his house, with parent supervision. His parents were there. My parents had rules like couldn't be no closed doors, those kinds of things. But we were able to also still find time, like to go for a walk or have a conversation in my dad's office, or and we snuggled, but we didn't on the surface. I don't know that there was a lot of physical interaction that was public, right? But certainly private, there was some. And I will say this: the SA began fairly quickly. It seemed like once the relationship had been established, that was because we were already married, right? Under God's eyes, we're already married. This is what's okay.
But from what I understood, you were clearly very young.
Yeah.
And you were not experienced in these kind of ways at all, or this wasn't exactly something you'd ever encountered? Okay.
No.
You grew up in a godly home, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So this was not something on your radar
Yes.
at all. I mean, not to like say that it would have been right, but it's just that, like, I know we live in an age of promiscuity and stuff, and that's not what we're talking about. So you sound like a very innocent lamb, if you ask me, like one that hasn't even come to understand certain things. And then like when you were mentioning about the prophetic thing, like it's almost just like those access cards. It sounds like he was taking it to a whole nother level of almost subduing you spiritually and exploiting your innate love and wish to do right before God, exploiting that. And it's just like I'm seeing already, and I know we just started this conversation, but so many like bells have gone off of the patterns I've seen with like Jane Doe,
right,
with even other ones that have been coming forward, and I'm like, wow, this is pervasive.
It is,
and people don't want to look at it.
While we're on this note too, I wanted to ask you this: how he was using the prophetic to really, and that's the spiritual abuse part. We have the physical, that's happening, the essay that's happening, but we also have spiritual abuse that's happening. He's taking your sincere love and desire to honor God and to do his will, and using that to fulfill his own perverted desires. So I wanted to get your feedback on this, Sarah, because right now we've been hearing a lot about prophetic manipulation in this space with all the church exposures that have been going on. I think it's kind of a new word for a lot of us, right? Because we, like you said, we've had this kind of prophetic charismatic movement that's happened the last few decades.
Even Susie Lamb said that. I didn't even know like the concept of spiritual abuse.
Right. This is because we're recognizing these patterns. A lot of people they're like, what's happening? Like the exposure in the church, right? So just like having people be mindful of that as they listen to these stories from survivors and from victims, like notice the similarities and the patterns in the stories, and from people who don't know each other, their stories are unrelated. Why is there so many similarities? It's because predators have patterns. They have patterns, and we can learn to recognize them and have these conversations. As a church, we can say, oh, these are patterns these are red flags. These are things we should say is our immediate no-nos. So it's good for us to talk about this.
These predators, and these leaders, they're not just preying on women, right? Like the innocent, the victim or the survivor. They're not just preying on that, and they're not just grooming them. They're grooming an entire community. They're grooming their fellow leaders. They're grooming their communities. They're grooming everybody, the survivors' families, right? So that no one's question. They put it's almost as if everyone around the community that's meant to protect suddenly is like falls under this, oh, he's a good guy, right? He's trustworthy. He loves the Lord. So then they give a free pass. So when other red flags show up, it's dismissed. It's like, well, that can't be. There's no and, right? There's no this and. It's or. Well, either he's a good guy or a bad guy. And that kind of framing doesn't work for identifying predators in the church. You have to be able to say, well, he might love the Lord. Sure, he might love the Lord, but also he might be causing harm, and we need to call that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And
just a quick biblical note, just even for me, if I added and just for myself later, but like this whole concept that you guys, as far as the patterns and this, what we're seeing, it's like scripturally, we're told not to be ignorant of the schemes of the enemy. You know, I feel like that's exactly what we're calling for. Like, guys, we see this pattern. We're shedding light on it. A lot of us have seen this pattern. A lot of us have experienced some form of abuse or harm or in these systems that we're calling the church. And so we are developing a language together to speak to what we're seeing, and we're there's a biblical mandate not to be ignorant of these schemes that we see, and there's certainly a lot of scheming.
Oh yeah, like wolves coming. Jesus said there's going to be wolves that come among you guys, and they're going to be wearing sheep's clothing. So as we've been seeing all this thing about prophetic manipulation that's happened, I was just like, I had this thought. I think if the same scenario happened not in a church context, like if a 26-year-old stranger, a man, came to your house and said, hey, I'm going to marry your 14-year-old daughter, like there'd be like immediate red flags, right? Or if this happened in any other scenario, guy came to your school, we'd be like, what?
My
like,
dads would go,
stranger danger.
There you are.
Yeah.
Or you're going to marry.
We would immediately recognize
Absolutely.
So I just like,
there's something, that's what I'm trying to, I guess I'm seeing this spiritual aspect of it is so serious.
So I wanted to hear your thoughts as somebody who went through this, where, you know, ministers use the prophetic to feed their own perversion. Like, what factors do you think contribute in these settings where we're not having the usual guards up that we would have if this happened in another setting outside of church?
From speaking from my experience too, there was a lot of like, well, God does the absurd. I don't know if that's still a popular saying, but like outside, it's the God of the absurd, you know, the God. Right, outside the box, right? There's all this rhetoric around the strangeness of God, or God will come and do something miraculous. And there seems to be, you know, almost an infatuation, right? With looking for it, something different and new and obscure maybe, right? And sometimes I think then we turn our brains off. It's a good way to just turn your brain off and not be aware of those red flags, of those gut checks. And I also think too, with the spirituality aspect of being influenced by, you know, I'm a firm believer that God designed our bodies, designed the physiology to work and operate a certain way. So that gut reaction of when there's danger is something to be tuned into. And I don't necessarily align with the doctrine of like, you can't trust your gut. Also the cultural conditioning of when someone is designated as hearing from God, right? That there's a sense that they know and they're closer to God. They have an inside track or an inside ear to, you know, the heart of God. So they must know more than I do. So if I don't understand, right, there's the scripture, his ways are higher than ours. And we don't always understand, right, what God might be doing. So I think that gets misused to then justify, well, you're just not enlightened enough. You just don't know what God's doing here. You're just not in on this inner circle of what God's speaking and saying.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think as even with Morningstar, like specifically, I shared this. We see that's another one of these patterns. We see this kind of almost elitism, right? Of like, well, we're this kind of special circle that we hear from God, and you're just not going to understand, you know, that goes beyond. God gave us reason and he gave us logic to see plainly things that we should be able to see this is wrong. You mentioned this, you know, when you shared your story with me that Dave had a very magnetic personality as well. And so I think that can affect people too. Could you share on that a little bit as well?
Yeah, I think, and I think almost anyone, now it's so funny because after I've come forward with my story, right, and particularly my peers that were in the youth group with me have come forward with different versions. And so while some have said that, yes, he was very magnetic, he was very like engaging, he liked to laugh, he'd make you laugh. There's a lot of, he just seemed to draw in a crowd, right? Just that kind of personality. I will say that there were several others that came to me and said, you know, felt a little uncomfortable, never really trusted him, right? Like there's this gut instinct. And it, on the other note too, I wanted to add in when you had said, about the, with people being told like you just don't understand this, you're not in the inner circle. There were peers of mine in that youth group that said and questioned, like, this feels strange to us, like this doesn't seem right. And they were literally told by leadership, I don't know who specifically, but they will tell you they were told not to question it. You don't know, you don't understand God's ways, don't question this, don't question God.
Wow. So really the grooming, as you said, extended beyond just you and your family. It extended into the community, because they're setting this precedent now for this entire church and for the other young people there, that like, this is okay when we hear from God, when God says it, and this man, he's anointed. And that, again, we hear the patterns. Like when you share that, I'm like, this is what we're hearing come out in so many of these stories. I mean, how do we have a man like Mike Bickle, for instance, at IHOP, who had this magnetic personality, he drew a crowd, but did this for decades, and we had no idea, and this just like he groomed not in just an entire community, but like the entire church, I feel like, and so I think it's really important we talk about this with the prophetic, because this is something, especially in these really kind of hyper charismatic, like you said, that stuff, the movement that was happening in the 90s and kind of extended beyond that. We're seeing that there's these people who are designated as this is a prophet. This is our prophet. He hears from God. And there's not really questioning. When biblically, Paul talks about if someone prophesies, let it be judged by 2 or 3 others. There's not just a blind acceptance of, oh yes, this man hears from God. We don't question anything, especially when, like you said, you have those gut checks.
Yeah, contextual understanding. Like, I don't even think he meant like, hey, make sure Bob Jones and Paul Kane are standing by to check Mike Bickle. You know what I mean? Like, that wasn't the idea there. It was like that, to me, anyways, I thought that was like the people of God, and maybe some of them are more in tune to the speaking forth of the truth of God.
Well, and I felt like that was even followed in my example, right? Like this is what the word of God, the word of the Lord is. This is what he's presenting as this is what the word of the Lord is. And then you had people confirming, like, yes, this is, but were they really confirming? Or were they like just wanting to gain favor, right? And to not stand in opposition, right? So I think that happens a lot. You get a lot of confirmation that shouldn't be confirmation. When we say judge it, we should look at it as like, does this make sense? Is this safe? Is this, really take it out. Is this biblical, right? Yes. We have to have litmus tests. It has to fit all of those things. God's not going to do something illegal.
Exactly. And I think some of this also has to do with the way that, again, what we've seen happen kind of in this space in the charismatic movement is where we have worshipped men's personalities. Like, that's just been such a huge thing in the church. And so I think people have like shelved things that they would normally recognize as red flags, because we're like the personality thing, and we're like, but he hears from God, and he's just he makes us all laugh and helps us be closer and teaches us the Bible. And we shelf what God, the intuition he gives us and the checks we get to say that, hey, that's not right. He can't be doing that.
The man of God mentality.
We're seeing it in the context of SA, right? We're seeing the spiritual abuse as a pattern, and the misuse of prophetic, and the harm it creates when it's used to then prey on young women, or grown women, or even young men in the church, right? But it's also harmful in so many other ways. When someone is dictating to someone else, this is what you should do with your life. This is what, how you should orchestrate your life. These are the decisions that you should make. Those things are harmful too. And I don't want to dismiss those levels of spiritual abuse, because that is horrific as well, right? It does destroy people's lives when it's misused.
I think that's powerful coming from you too, as one who has been through one of the harder situations dealing with SA and all of that combined and how it works together. And
when you try to get out of this relationship, so a man who's your spiritual authority, 12 years older than you, like he's telling you you're doubting God.
Let's just acknowledge that. I have no, right? Like I have no on any level. I cannot get out of this. And I want to make this clear. There was no way that I could get out of this relationship, right? Because he had already established himself as, I hear from God. I'm God's spiritual, authority here, and I'm the authority figure. And in the culture that I grew up in, right, with the man of God, or the your husband being the one that can hear spiritually from God, and that he's charged with taking care of you, that you submit. That was the culture that I grew up in. And so right now he's positioned himself as not only the person that hears from God, but now he's my going to be husband, right? So he is the spiritual authority in my life, ultimately, even more so than maybe my father would have been at that point. So I have no way of, at this point, because I 100% believe that God is telling me that he's my husband. So I have to defer to him, and I have to obey him, if you will, and submit unto him. So I can't say no to any SA. I can't say no to, really, I have no voice, right? Through this whole betrothal, I have no voice, because he is ultimately already positioned, even though we're not legally married, he's ultimately put himself in that position. And then who am I going to tell? Who am I going to come out to at that point with any concerns? Because then it's a betrayal to my husband, right? In that space. And again, I was not married, but right, there's that, he had established and was using that authority already. And that was really, had just stripped me of all autonomy at that point.
So he's gaslighting you the whole time.
Well, and I want to say, like, to me, it's exploiting your love for God, because God teaches us it's out of our love that we obey him. You want to obey what God would have had for you, because you believe he has your best interest in mind, even if maybe sometimes we don't understand things, but like that, like, it's exploiting that innate desire to obey God and now inserting himself in that place. It's such a dangerous place to place oneself in. I don't think that some of these men really understand that. Like,
Sarah, you told me about during this time, this betrothal, you and your family, I think, made a trip down to Morningstar. So I'm going to have you share about that. But first, I just wanted to share for other people to establish for them the Morningstar and Abide relationship. I know you had shared with me, I thought was important that they weren't just loosely connected, but they were very deeply connected. It wasn't just like, hey, we kind of know Morningstar, we're affiliated, we rub shoulders. Like, they were very deeply connected. You mentioned that. And so I just wanted to share for other people, just kind of show that, directly from Morningstar's website. Just for others to know, Sarah's church, Abide in the Vine, was considered a Morningstar Fellowship of Ministries church. And what that means is that Morningstar was essentially their umbrella, their covering, their spiritual covering. MFM, they claim that they're there to help other ministries, equip them in their work and provide covering for them, and navigate their ministry functions. But they also say there was a couple different levels of this membership. It's a membership that ministries can buy into. Which is kind of weird to me that you can buy accountability from a big ministry, but apparently you can.
my aunt with like those triangle things where she gets
the multi-level marketing.
Yeah, that's what it feels like. The multi-level marketing. At this level, at this level, you get invited to this conference, and then this prophetic luncheon with so and so, right?
But that's literally what their website says. Like, I screenshotted it.
Oh, I know.
Like, they have an entire list.
Sarah didn't even know that. No, it's like joke.
They have an entire list of their benefits, which is all just this big list of like special seating at conferences and getting to rub shoulders with other spiritual leaders. Of course, they word it in a way that it sounds more normal. You 20% off at our bookstore and special invites and special roundtable events.
Those roundtable events, right?
But then
do they list Rick? They don't give you like Rick himself on just some special.
Yeah, they don't claim Rick, but they just say you'll have like basically one-on-one with some of our high leaders, that are gonna give you prophetic counsel in your life. Well, we've learned what a crock their prophetic counsel is.
Danger.
But I highlighted just so others can see that they specifically say this as one of their member benefits for MFM churches is that prophetic counsels during pivotal times of ministry, such as crossroads, moments, or times of crisis, where prophetic teams can give direction or provide insight. So like they even bake this into their language.
Coordinate with Eric Voles with the crisis thing.
Yeah, maybe.
They'd be a deadly duo.
They have and then they specifically say, you know, that they're there for covering for those churches. And they say the lower tier one, the less expensive, the discount option is just to, you know, it's just like you're associating with us.
Yes.
And you know, you still get some benefits. To me, it sounds like a list of like you're associated with Morningstar, you get some of these benefits at conferences, and you'll get some counsel from us. But they specifically say for those for their lower tier, for Fellowship of Ministries, that if you have any issues, that while remaining primarily accountable to another ministry, so like they're not going to handle your stuff. If you have crisis or issues and your pastor's caught doing something, you're not accountable to us. But this higher tier, which is the Fellowship of Churches,
which is the morning,
which is what Sarah's.
That's what Abide is, and it says that.
Are they still not to this day?
To this day.
So to this day, this is what they are.
I reported in 2019, 2020. I was right to assume like this goes to Morningstar, and I, you know, put my specific request. Report this to Morningstar. Get Morningstar involved. I wanted Morningstar involved, right? In this, I wanted them to have a response.
Yeah, but they say after a year of being, you know, this, you can be the Fellowship of Churches, and then like you're essentially
you're in the pack.
You're in the pack. You're like an extension of Morningstar, and they're your head honchos that you go to for anything. For crisis, they say it specifically.
You had specific language of that.
I did.
Really
I did.
They're still putting that mentality that brought harm to you, essentially this covering theology idea that they're putting on young daughters and sons. They do that he's still doing that. It was that kind of verbiology, I feel like, that he even uses in the thing, like where you're covered, you know, as a church.
Yes.
I mean, I know a lot of people use that language, but I think we really need to strongly consider some of these things that we're saying. Like, is it biblical?
Yeah, when you say you're covering, does that mean you actually cover for them when they're sin? Because that's what they do.
Like, we might need to translate, what are those things called that people use? Euphemisms.
It's a euphemism.
It's like a euphemism.
Because now that directory you mentioned is now online, and there's like tons of pages, because they mean that every ministry is bad and that there's horrible things going on, right? There can be just normal churches who don't see what's going on at Morningstar. And that's honestly people that we want to help the most. We want to help people that don't see this.
Right, yes.
We want to help open their eyes that there is systemic abuse that happens here that's not dealt with. They say on their website there's like over 400 ministries.
Can you imagine how I'm sure they're paying, like, so all these people pay is it like a monthly or yearly?
I have
probably yearly, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
A yearly commitment. So they're getting big lump sums of money from these churches. I'm sure if you add them all together.
They are.
This is quite the business scheme.
It is.
Thought up in 95.
It really is.
They're still trying to run this thing, and churches are going along with it. Many of them.
And that's why I think it's important we talk about this, because...
Oh, can I just... I'm so sorry.
Go ahead.
Ron Cantor, he's a strong leader, I feel like, for me, that's been speaking up. I don't know if you might have heard him some, but he's been speaking up a lot on X, I would say. But
especially with IHOP.
He's a leader in the body of Christ, a very strong voice. And he recently, what was it that he just had come against him?
He's been calling out Rick Joyner on X in Morningstar.
They told him, and he's pretty big. He's a strong leader. It doesn't matter. I don't know how big his following is, literally, but like it's like the idea here is what did they tell him?
The church, some of these church leaders told him that
a major leader in the body of Christ reached out and said basically he's become a stench in the literally, this is the language that they use, a stench in the nostrils to the leaders, to many, like, basically high-level leaders in the body of Christ. Yeah. As they consider themselves that. So I'm just, as I'm seeing this, I'm thinking it must be a lot of these leaders.
Yeah, these kind of churches.
And specifically referencing him speaking up against Rick Joyner and the cover-up culture he's created with these churches.
And he's been speaking up a lot for victims and their stories, and being, like, using what platform he has to say, we need to listen to these people. this is a problem, and I don't want to. I don't want this on my watch.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're coming against him too.
Yeah.
There's just not a lot of leaders that are really shining brightly right now, I guess, for some people to see in this space, and so he's a notable mention.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. To me, a lot of the people we've looked to as leaders in this church space, that we've kind of looked when things are going on, what are they saying, or what are they're the ones being silent on this, or even worse, they're pushing back and saying that we're attacking them, we're moving with Satan.
Yes.
And so I'm sure the ones speaking up are pretty smelly or whatever to them,
We probably are a stench to them,
but for us, it's a sweet aroma.
Yeah, it is.
For leaders to actually speak into this space with a strong voice.
Yes. Oh,
I don't know if you got to see Shane Winnings, but he spoke up on a Daystar situation. But I know he's been a strong voice in this space. If you want to check him out, or others.
That gives me hope.
I want to put in plugs for good leaders.
That gives me
I love Laura.
Because that's hope.
And it feels like just kind of, I mean, honestly, people like us, just who wouldn't have considered ourselves church leaders, right? Who have just we're hopping on social media, we're hopping on YouTube, and we're talking, we're having these conversations, telling our stories. It kind of feels like we're having to become the voice we were looking to. We're having to we were looking for leadership in these areas, and hey, how should we move forward in this? Can you guide us? And oh no, you can't. We have to help people see that this is not okay. We have to look at this. We have to acknowledge it in the church.
We esteem one another, and we hear one another's stories. We mourn. What is it? Mourn with those who mourn, and rejoice with those who rejoice. And we esteeming one another above one another.
Yeah.
These are the verses that they don't really. How can you operate by that? One man superstar model. It's just not gonna work.
Yeah.
You can't. Right. That becomes the esteem of the whole house as the man on the stage. And I don't know. I don't want to get on my soapbox. Stage driven.
Yeah, no, it's
but that's a very key part of it. I think that's part of what has affected it and why there's
to daughters and sons. And I don't think that everybody, that's not to say everybody means to bring harm.
Yeah.
Even maybe some of the people at your church and stuff, it's the wool really gets pulled over some good people's eyes too,
It does.
And this is all just from their website. They have the brief history of MFM. And so it says Rick Joyner started this in 1995. And just for reference, when did this start with your abuse?
1996 would have been the summer of 1996 is when we went down to that conference and had I believe that's when they had conversation, right, with Robin McMillan. I think Donna Hoover was there, and I think she had conversation with other leaders at Morningstar.
Yeah, so literally a year after Rick establishes this, there's already abuse happening within one of these affiliate churches of theirs. Right. He says the vision of the network was to be established on relationships. And then he quotes the Proverbs 17:17, a friend loves at all times and a brother is born for adversity. That's a good verse, but the way that it's used, so they just did a video on Todd Bentley that came out.
Wanda Alger.
Yep.
Wanda
She's
Alger.
a really strong voice too.
And some of the people who ran in Todd's circles who weren't really seeing how abusive he was being, who are now seeing, they interviewed them, kind of like this. They shared that was the verse, the exact verse that he uses to say, you need to cover for me when I'm doing these things and messing up and abusing people. You're supposed to be my brother, and brothers are born for adversity. So this is just part of it. When we go and do all these things, this is just part of it. And so,
and he would often use, I think it's Proverbs 17:17. A brother is born for adversity. And he would always use this, hey, we're brothers. We were born for adversity. And then he would go make a bad decision and say, remember, we were born to stick with each other in adversity. And then he'd expect people to stick with him through the adversity and use that verse in that way. But what we didn't know at the time was that this was a grooming tactic. Yeah. I didn't know that.
It stuck out to me that Rick uses this verse, and knowing the history of Morningstar and just how much abuse has happened there in the cover-up, I'm like, what a manipulation of scripture and what it means to be a brother and to stand through adversity. together.
And this was a guy similar to you. I think he wants to obey the Lord. Like, what is that true? You know, and then it like it gets weaponized. And like even as I'm thinking about this now, like this is what Satan did with Jesus in the wilderness. Like he used the scriptures to try to bind the King of Kings, right? The one who's over it all. He sought to bind by the script because he knew like there's no other way to get to a lamb or a child of God's heart in that way, I feel like, except that you manipulate what that they think they're doing the right thing, and yet they're being deceived sometimes. They think, oh, well, that's what it means because that man of God told me that's what it meant. And he's anointed and he's above me. And there's a truth in us yielding to Christ and like being respectful to leaders and like having, like, we don't want to be boisterous people or like, you know, just rebel against, but like when that's why I think it's so damnable when they manipulate it against us. You almost become powerless, especially a young one learning to follow the Lord.
All that to establish that they were very closely connected. And I think you even said you heard some, remember hearing certain phrases when you were younger. If you want to share those.
I remember hearing like in church, being in the congregation when they had the conversation about we're going to affiliate ourselves with Morningstar. There was a lot of conversation about the importance of that apostolic covering, of the apostolic ministry, and really having another organization in which you could come under, leadership that could provide this accountability, could provide this covering. They talked a lot about spiritual covering and those kinds of principles and how important it was. And so that when they announced that this is what we're officially going to do, I remember hearing that in church and the whole principle and concept behind it, which strikes me now, right? Because where's the accountability, the covering. Now, as we're hearing those scriptures, I'm thinking, was there that covering aspect? Did they go into that thinking that like, if we run into a problem, they'll just make it go away, versus that, we'll help you deal with this in a, so you're not on your own in a true, like, scripturally based space and that's what I had hoped for and thought that was the purpose of this church coming underneath, Morningstar. And it seemed that Morningstar was, in fact, consulted on other issues. Certainly Morningstar was consulted on this. And I believe that because when my family had gone down, right, to one of the Morningstar conferences that spring of, I think it's early summer of 96. And my family stayed with Robin McMillan in his house. I can't remember if he was there or not. I know we had dinner with him at a restaurant at one point. I don't remember if they actually were there, but we'd stayed in a house. I'm still 14 years old. I'm not like at these tables. I'm not at this conference. I'm doing the children's, literally the youth part of this conference, right? But I know from hearing, my parents having a conversation or my mom having a conversation that she knew that conversation, because she was upset that conversations were happening without her being present. So she knew that, Fred and Donna were having conversations with Morningstar, and certainly bared out that later on, because I knew Robin McMillan knew about my situation, right, and knew that I was being betrothed, right, to this pastor. And then later on, I think some of the tone had changed. I think that people in the church, right, were starting to get concerned, like, hey, this doesn't fit right. This doesn't feel right. There's some concern about the age difference, concern about my well-being in that sense. So conversations started to happen, and I think there was some opposition that came up. Steve Thompson gave me a call personally, and this is the only person from Morningstar that I spoke to about the relationship directly. And he called me at my house, and I remember the conversation being about my age and my maturity level, and that he was concerned that this would interrupt my overall development as a child, right? Rightfully so. He was right on. Yes, this was going to happen. But what didn't happen in that phone call and in that conversation was I don't think he recognized that I was completely powerless. I remember being on the phone with him and being like, what do you want me to do? What do I do with this information? I literally had that feeling of like, okay, so where do I go with this information? You're concerned for me? Okay, I got it. What he didn't ever say in that conversation, I don't believe that this is the word of the Lord for you. I don't believe that this is what God is saying for your life. There was never any question about that. He didn't question that. He never said, I believe that this person is abusing his power and his position. I never heard him say this is a manipulation of the prophetic. I never heard him say we're concerned that he's a predator. I never heard him say any of those things. Just concern over the age difference.
Wow.
And so,
and this is like the senior.
Yeah.
I think he was like the second pastor, like next to Rick at that point. I'm pretty sure he's one of the higher up pastors.
I mean, and you guys are the high tier accountability church. So
I hold Morningstar accountable, certainly in the sense, not just the church, because of that covering. And Steve Thompson, he called me right back in the early mid 90s, I guess it was, to express his concerns. That who does that unless there is that accountability factor, right? And that knowledge, obviously he knew about it.
I'm honestly amazed that he's having a phone call, first of all, with a 14-year-old girl. I'm just going to remind people of that. Wow. She's 14. Okay?
I'm glad for the reminder, and I'm sitting here having the conversation.
Because we're thinking of Sarah we're talking to today. Yeah, it's very mature and very wise.
No, I'm 14. I'm 14.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
And it's on a landline, right? This is back then. It was a landline phone call.
And so one of the head senior pastors of Morningstar, which is the covering for your church, the spiritual covering and accountability for your church, bought and paid for. Yep. He's aware that the 26-year-old male youth pastor is betrothed to you, a 14-year-old girl, and that alone is not enough for immediate intervention. And as you shared, not just like a phone call that I'm concerned. I feel like at that point, there's no spiritual process to work through. There's I need to call the authorities. I need to call the police or CPS. And this girl needs to be evaluated because she's likely been harmed. This guy needs to be investigated. That's the kind of process that should have been intervened. Not I'm concerned for you. That just,
Right.
They didn't take, you know what I mean? That's what's dumbfounding to me, is that just alone that the pastor was baiting his 14-year-old youth.
You put it in perspective.
My impression of the situation is I don't think that they ever saw it as abuse or manipulation. I think that they let Dave run with this belief that that God had, I don't think they were questioning the prophecy. I don't think they were questioning the prophetic word. And if they did, they certainly never said it.
In my mind, I'm so why is Rick and Steve Thompson, why don't they go grab him up by the collar, sit him down in a room, and hey, let us know about it. Tell us about it. What word did you hear from the Lord? Okay, let us test that, because we're the prophets here as they present themselves, or the voices of authority over the whole thing. And so it's especially, I know Steve Thompson was for a season, because that was when Erica was there. He was there, and that's when he was
that was fired. That was 2009, the latter part of 2009.
Okay.
That was part of what I think stuck out to you when you reached out to me, is because I mentioned that he was just suddenly fired and we didn't know what happened. Of course, Leah later found out that they called girls in because there had been instances of SA connected to him. So, as well as another leader. And it kind of shows you too that when it doesn't get checked back then, and the mid 90s, it's not dealt with. It's not said, hey, this isn't okay. No discipline that should have happened and healing for you. Instead it goes on. It continues to go on. And so that when we come to school, 10 years later, right? A decade later, there's there's still massive amounts of SA and spiritual abuse happening at this institution.
The point that young boys who are just now, I guess coming of age, and where they're able to actually file lawsuits and stuff, where their stories can actually get out there.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a decade later after that. So 2009, and that happened later. We have
Yes.
Catherine, and we have the boys who were being
Yep.
essayed by their youth
Yep.
leader. So it's like this stuff continues to go on because it's never dealt with. And that's what I think of what we want people to understand when we're talking about this at Morningstar. Like there's not like this agenda of like, we hate Morningstar, take down there is systemic abuse that is not dealt with there. And there's covering of sin and honestly of crimes that has happened.
And these are are the former students and the children of the Lord that were in your houses and in these churches. We listened to them. We listened to them so much. We took their words so seriously.
We gave them our trust.
Yeah.
Yes.
We wrote notes.
Just like, like it's like the little children. Yeah. Right. We took notes. We lived and breathed it. We were in it, right? We were bought in 100%. So for anyone to come back and say, oh, you just have a vendetta against Morningstar. No, understand we gave our lives. We invested who we were and what we wanted to like. We invested in Morningstar and in these churches. And this is the harm, right? This is the harm we experienced. And so hear us say, when we come out and we're saying this harm, we're coming to say, let there be change, because listen, we're seeing this happen back in the 90s. Then we're seeing what has changed between now and then, and nothing has changed.
Things have gotten worse.
No one has learned.
It's gotten because you've gotten away with it.
It's worse.
Absolutely.
Yes.
He got you gifts like frequently, right?
Oh, all the time. Yes. He would always buy me gifts, little things. Sometimes they're little things from like Cracker Barrel. He bought me roses, like at least half a dozen. I want to say almost weekly. Like it was pretty regular, especially early on, because I had them all dried and hanging in my bedroom for forever. And so he was constant, like gifts in the showering, and the letters. He would write long letters and just kind of that love. We hear about like the love bombing now. We kind of know that that's a tactic as well of just, I love you so much, and all the things that you're so wonderful, and all the things that are great about you. It was still the summer, so it was early summer, I think, of '96, and we had a youth conference hosted there at Abide in the Vine, and there was another youth group they were from actually Canada, that had come down, and some of those girls were staying, like we put them up like in host families, right, houses and stuff. So some of the girls were staying at our house, my parents' house, and some of the girls were in my room, and we're just doing girl things like 14-year-olds do, and like talking and doing nails and that kind of stuff. And they noticed the dried roses that were hanging in my room, and they'd asked the question like, oh wow, where did all of those roses come from? And so I shared the story. I was like, well, actually, let me tell you, like God has revealed who my husband's going to be, and I'm betrothed to the youth pastor, and just sharing the story. And their reaction was like, oh wow, that's kind of amazing. Like at least one of the girls' reaction was like, that's so cool that you know who God wants you to marry now. They had gone and told their youth leaders, rightfully so. And later the next day, in the middle of this retreat, the youth leaders packed up their kids, all of them, and said, we're out of here. And they took off. And the pastor's wife, Donna Hoover, came to me. I remember her coming to me in the sanctuary, because it was kind of an abrupt thing, right? You don't just normally leave the conference in the middle of a conference. And it was noticeable, and there was a lot of conversation about what had happened. And so she came to me to ask what happened. And I, just said, well, I just shared about, the flowers in my room and shared the story. And she said to me, she goes, Sarah, and I remember her saying to me, you have to be careful about who you talk about this with. Like it's not that it's wrong, but that other people aren't going to understand it, and good people could get hurt. So you need to be careful.
Wow.
And so I learned very quickly, like, oh, I can't talk about this relationship. I'm not supposed to talk about this. It's okay. Right? No one's telling me that I need to get out of this relationship, but I can't talk about it, which then layered on that layer of secrecy, right? And with the essay, I want to, right? Yeah, and I want to say, like, the layer of essay, it made it harder for me to come out and talk about that later, because in a way it was saying, well, it's okay, just don't talk about it, right? Like, it just made it really, really difficult, and it created the space in my mind that I was like, this is confirmed, it's okay, just you can't share, right?
That's an important note. And I remember the small gifts thing too, because I just want others to be aware that this is part of like the grooming process for predators. Like,
we see this in everyone, which is so crazy because it makes me think back to when you're a kid and it's like they're trying to give you candy to get you, but it's like the plain sight thing. Yeah, like every story I feel like
everyone we've heard of these church exposures, you'll hear like there was special attention given, and they were giving them gifts and buying them little things. You know, that this is part of what predators do to groom people. You know, and even in others' eyes, they'll do it in public spaces to get other people used to it. Like, this is okay. You know, this was the pastor's wife, right? So pretty much as part of the head of the church, who's telling you don't talk about this. Which, I mean, honestly, this is another layer of spiritual abuse, because there's condoning what's going on. It's clearly wrong, and not. But then even telling you that if you talk about this, like, other people could get hurt. Instead of you, the one who's experiencing this, good people could get hurt. Like, this girl's being hurt. This girl's being hurt right now. I feel like this ties into the prophetic manipulation part again, and kind of those like smaller circles of secrecy and elitism, and like, we're hearing from the Lord. They take principles that can be true. They'll use things that can be true, but they twist them and wrongly apply them. And like, some people may not realize they're doing it because they're just perpetuating that system. And some people deliberately are doing it. You know, like, you can't talk to someone about this because they won't understand. Well, like, is there circumstances in everyone's life we all have where we have things maybe that we don't want to talk about to everyone because they might not understand? Like, sure, like, you hear it in these other circles too. People don't understand. They're not on this level of spirituality with you. You know, they're not going to understand, but they'll use that principles like that to justify wrongdoing, very clear wrongdoing that's happening.
Sarah, I don't find you to be a bitter person. Like, even in my conversation with you, and
not at all
how I've seen you share this story and the way that you're conveying it, you carry it very healthily. But you've had to drink in many ways. You were given a bitter cup. This is not something that a young one should have to walk through.
Like, she was given a bitter cup to drink.
But that doesn't make you bitter. You know what I mean? It makes you you walk through something that was not a good experience, and your heart muscles had to come alive more. We do have to fight back. Like, you know, if somebody does something really hard, like, there is I guess the flesh or whatever you describe it as, that you have to check your heart. But like, it doesn't. I don't know.
Well, I think you were kind of driving in a little bit of like, just forgiveness doesn't negate accountability, right? It doesn't negate the need for change. And so while we can forgive and we can have empathy and we can have understanding for where someone was at and the information they had at the time, it doesn't mean that you don't call out the harm and that you don't say, you can't keep doing this. This pattern of behavior needs to stop. That's not anti-forgiveness. In fact, that's a very forgiving thing to do, to say, let's stop this pattern of harm. If it is then taking that and saying, okay, how do we heal from this? How do we create cultures of safety? Grace, we all have grace, right? And grace is saying that you are still lovable, that there's redemption, right? There's a possibility for doing things differently. There's a possibility for change. It's when you continue to make the same decision over and over again and claim grace, well, I'm under God's grace, or God's not going to, remove my mantle because I didn't cross this line. That's not God's grace. God's grace is, here's opportunity for change. Again and again, choose the right path, right? Grace is being with me and making sure that I have ability to heal, that I have resources, that I have people that have stepped in and platforms to share the story, right? That's grace too, right?
Even Christ calls, like, if your brother or your sister has something against you, like, leave your gift on the altar, go and make it right. So he's not saying they're wrong and they should be forgiving you, and they should be like, no, maybe they have forgiven you, but you did it wrong by it, and you need to go make it right. Leaders and people that haven't been doing right by young ones in the body, like, there needs to be a making it right factor. I don't know fully what that looks like, but I think that needs to come forward.
Acknowledgement of harm, right? Like just the acknowledgement of like, I did this. The survivor's perspective of someone that in and of itself holds a lot, right? A true apology of acknowledging I did this and this was harmful to you. This is how it was harmful to you. And how can I make it right? Right. And then the acknowledgement of trying to repair. And that's what has to happen in these spaces is the acknowledgement of understanding of, and that's going to take some time of understanding the harm, right? There has to be that aspect. You fully, right? And right. And then how do I make this right? And that part of it. And particularly like when you come forward and you're talking like about the church, right? You start even within your own family, you think about like how is this going to affect them, right? Like my sister is still married to Pastor Fenton's oldest son, right? And although he's super yeah, like right, you just think about like how is this going to affect them? How is this going to affect my sister? How is this going to affect, my brother-in-law and there, there are other people that it does affect, and it's impossible to come forward and talk about that talk about your story without thinking about those pieces. And so it does take a little extra. But then you think about other things, like other people who, like, if they had had this information, if they had known before, like what things could have been prevented. If we had done things differently way back in the 90s or even, 10 years ago, how many less victims would there be, right? How many other people would not have to be in this space of survival and healing? And then that's what drives me, right? Is this aspect of protecting the community. And that's where I feel like so many people need to wake up and listen and pay attention to these stories, because we have an obligation to keep future generations safe. And it's on us. We can't always rely on the criminal justice system or, even in the civil cases. We have to call that out. We have to call that action into being of accountability and change and safe places.
100%.
People they have no choice to believe you now because you have a conviction. But how many young women maybe they don't have maybe certain evidence, or they're not able to apprehend the guy, or they can't find him, or there's a lot of things that you have to press through.
And
It seems like
one of the things that made my story easier to, I think, and an easier case to prosecute is that because it was such a public relationship, right, that there were so many others that had seen, witnessed, there's corroboration that no one was saying that this relationship didn't happen. So that, really helped set that groundwork for, that she's believable, right? It gave a lot of credibility to my overall story because everyone else had been part of that.
Yeah.
So after those controversies were raised and there was aspect of, I think, concern among people in the congregation, elders, the story I heard, right, from Pastor Dave was that this was, attack of the enemy, that this was those people in church siding with man versus, God's. And that was the spin that he had given me and certainly my parents at that point in time. So he left. He had another opportunity to work with another ministry. And so he left for that. And I don't ever remember there being a conversation, if he had been asked. So it's come out since all of this that there's speculation that the head pastor, Pastor Fred, had asked David to leave, that he'd asked for his resignation. There was perhaps a stipulation. Again, I don't have any evidence. No one from the church has come to me directly, provided any kind of testimony. You see that in the charging documents. No one provided any testimony that had happened. So I don't know if that's true that happened, but if it had happened, they still blessed him when he left. They still prayed over him, as churches do when someone in leadership moves on to another church. They kind of make the announcement and they pray for them and bless them. So that happened. After that happened, he wasn't attending a regular church, and because I was with him, I was not also attending a regular church. Sometimes I went with my parents who went to a local Methodist church. But I was really taken away from all of my peers. He had also encouraged my parents to homeschool me for my benefit, for my protection, which, now it was really, I think, to get me out of the eyes of the school. And obviously he knew I was keeping a journal and didn't want me to say anything or write anything about what might be happening, between us. So I think that there was, that was the reasoning really for me moving into the homeschool space. And then it was really focused on, like, this is your life. You finish school and you prepare to get married, right? Like, I was reading bride magazines and basically planning wedding my whole childhood, right? So from like 15 to 17 was just school and prepare to get married. I didn't attend, any youth group events. I wasn't part of our youth community. No, I had my family, so my family was around and I would spend time with them. And if my brothers had, or my sister had, friends over, I could interact with them there. But pretty much I was fairly well isolated. Now we know, right, as we know with abusers, that's a tactic that they use to isolate you from other peers. And that certainly happened for me. And then we were scheduled to get married. So our wedding was scheduled for June 12th, I guess it would have been 1998. And right before, so it was literally like days before the wedding was supposed to take place, he got sick with pancreatitis and ended up in the hospital. And then we had to postpone the wedding. And he spent months really in hospital recovery. And it was at that time that I started to re-engage with the youth group at Abide in the Vine, because they were just, as soon as I could, it was like, let me just re-engage, let me be with my friends and spend time with them. And I did that summer. And so it was natural for me to then return back to Abide in the Vine, because that's where my friends were going. And the relationship ended, and I will tell you that he ended the relationship because he said that while he was in the hospital, that an angel of the Lord appeared to him and told him that I would ruin his ministry. And so therefore I was no longer, fit to be his wife, that God was essentially saying that this relationship was over. And he did it over the phone. He didn't do it in person. There was no care. And looking back on it now, I'm like, wow, that was a really awful experience to have this relationship that I was, told was, God ordained and my purpose and destiny, for him to suddenly change the narrative and do it over the phone with such little care, concern, certainly no empathy, no love, nothing, right? It wasn't like a typical breakup. And I had never experienced a breakup before. This was my first relationship, so I didn't even have that to compare to, right? And so I took that away as like, this is the narrative that I took from that was, I have failed God, right? Like that, in that moment, I was like, I'm no longer worthy to be this man's wife, because I know what had happened, right? And I'm thinking that this is because of the sexual sin in the relationship. Me, again, not putting it into context of, what was really happening. And so I went back to Abide in the Vine though. And that's where, I think through kind of the events that took place, because I was in a spot, I was just 17 years old. So I'm still, a young person, not a full grown adult, not with, the functionality and brain development of a full adult either. And I'm like looking for care. And my youth group was, I will say that they were like the lifesavers in that space. They just surrounded me with a lot of love. But it wasn't like we talked about like what had happened too much. It was not really a topic of conversation. But it was that same fall that I had a friend that was going to Morningstar School of Ministry down. So I was like, I'm going to take a trip and go visit her. And while I'm there, I thought I would try to get in touch with Steve Thompson. So I called and asked to meet with him, to have a meeting. But he called, I can't even remember if it was him directly that called first or if it was the secretary. But they said, and eventually I did get a phone call with him. And in that phone call, he said that he didn't have time to meet with me, and that the only thing he had to say to me was that he stood by what he originally told David Fenton, which was not to get involved with me for 2 more years. And he goes, and that's all I have to say about it. And then he's like, but if you come down and you want to say hi, say hi. And that was it. Like,
Yeah.
I just like, here I am, like, right, even, and I don't think I had any intention of divulging any kind of essay at that point, right? Like, it just wasn't on my radar to do, because at that point, I'm fully thinking that I'm at fault, and they're only going to judge me, and I'm going to be the one that's in trouble. And so, but I was looking for care and concern around how do you explain the prophetic in this? How do you explain how I've given my life to this prophetic word, and now it's suddenly changed. God suddenly changed his mind. Someone in leadership, please give me some direction on how this happened, right? And I never got that.
I mean, I can imagine that would be unsettling.
Like, very confusing, because here you've just been convinced for the last formative years of your childhood, you know, you're going into adulthood, like, that this was your destiny, and then suddenly it's not your destiny anymore.
Yeah.
And the person who didn't intervene, you know, one of the head pastors at Morningstar couldn't give an answer.
And it's hard to hear that you had to go through that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful you are coming forward as such a strong voice. I think it's so needed right now, because I do think maybe a lot of people were in the place you were. They're just not, it's not even on their radar. I know we've heard from some people, maybe they want to get off a little, but they definitely don't want to, like, face maybe some of the backlash that they feel will be there.
Like, I don't really care if, you know, some of these leaders, if Rick Joyner calls me a wolf or calls me demonic, but when your family, when people you know question you and doubt you, and kind of come against you bringing your story forward, that's hard. And I think that's what people don't get. Like, in this space, especially when people are sharing their stories, they're not realizing what someone has to overcome just in themselves, just to be able to speak it to someone. You know, and I shared this with you, Sarah, but I'll just share here too for other people listening. As somebody who experienced child SA myself, like, when I finally did talk to and confront it, and I'm in my, you know, early 30s, even family were like, well, why are you bringing this up now? Why now? What's, you know, and they just immediately question that. And I think that it's a problem of how we handle this in the church. We need to be able to listen to people with open ears and open hearts and hear, this is what they walked through. This is what they experienced. Like, who are we to question it right now? Let's let them tell their story.
And I finally disclosed to my parents, which, by the way, it took me decades. I mean, it took me decades to finally realize that that was never God's will for my life. Like, I had been so convinced that that followed me a very, very long time.
With your
and so it
too,
wasn't.
right? I mean, the agreement of your parents and the confusion that would have created in your relationship within, and all the complexity.
Yeah, and I had to work through that, right? Like, that was a lot for my parents and I in our relationship to work through, of how did you let this happen, and me even it took me a lot to disclose to them. I disclosed the pieces because I certainly didn't want. I knew that they had always tried to protect me and had my best interest at heart. I certainly don't think that they were, you know, offering me up as a sacrifice in any way, right? Like, they really had hearts of wanting to protect me, and so I knew that this would
consider them a victim
crush them.
well to
Yeah. Yes. And in fact, it was when I realized, right, that predators do groom the entire family, right? They groom the community, and we've talked about that. When I first realized that, it was the first thing I did was call my parents and be like, "Oh my gosh, you guys were groomed too. That's why all of this was happening. This is why he was spending so much time at our house. This is why he was gaining favor with you. It's because he was grooming you too."
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And as we've learned, like, they look for places, I think, to be around, where there's going to be families, where there's going to be kids, and I think positions that we typically trust, like authority positions, like pastors, like coaches, like teachers. You know what I mean? Things that we typically tend to not question as much, and yet we see them. They happen in every sphere. In every sphere, we find them, that they go to these places. So I think that's why, another reason, like, it's important to recognize so other people can recognize in their communities grooming patterns. At any point during this relationship, did anyone ask you if you were okay, or if any physical barriers had been crossed?
Okay, so I love that question. And yes and no. No one was checking with me to see if I was okay. Um, the one thing that I will say is that my dad regularly would ask me the question, "Are you having sex?" Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, we can always be.
And, and the reason that that was so important is because Fenton was always trying to get me to go further, right? In that context of we're married under God's eyes. It's okay. And the one aspect I was able to say was that I can't lie to my dad. And my dad asked me this question, and David's response to me was, well, it's not what we're doing isn't full on sex, right? So it's okay to keep doing what we're doing. And that's what I held on to that. Like I kept saying that as like my dad would check in every so often to say that. And so he was the only one that was actually asking me, but it was the terminology that he was using that then had, and I know right within purity culture, we always have all these loopholes around, what is and what isn't, what classifies.
And that just gave Dave another kind of leverage point. Well, here's how I manipulate her out of this part, so I can keep doing what I'm doing and keep the grooming going.
So right after that same week that I had made that phone call to Steve Thompson's office, I was invited to Pastor Fred and Donna's for dinner at their house. And I made some notes in my journal about it, and I wasn't always aware, I feel like, at that time of like things that were happening or going on. But I remember them telling me some things, and then they would start a story about like, so I just want to clarify, I didn't have after the relationship ended with Fenton, I saw him one other time in a public space and didn't ever have contact with him again. I never had another phone conversation, never saw him in any space. Like we just did not cross paths again. But I was aware, and it's a small community, right? And he's going through all of these health issues, and so he was being talked about a lot. And when I went to that dinner, Pastor Fred and Donna had given me like a health update on, recent things that were going on with his health, but then also started to talk about some other things. And they would start a story and then say, oh, but I'm not at liberty to say more. And later I found out through the investigation and then talking to other people that during that time frame, he had been hitting on other women in other churches. To the point that it made them uncomfortable enough that they came forward, which we know we're as women we usually like dismiss a lot. So it had to have been enough for people to be uncomfortable enough to make a comment right to their leadership. And I find it ironic or questionable, right, that then they knew, right, that he had been predatory, because that's what that is, in that space right after, but they never stopped at that point to ask me if anything had happened. But what they did do was pray with me at that dinner to break any soul ties. And then that was it. Never a question. And that's where I'm like, if you knew or had suspicion that this was not a safe space or safe relationship or question about him, why didn't you then ask me when I came back into the church and under your care? Why didn't you ask me if I was okay? Why didn't you ask me if anything had happened? Nobody asked me the question of did he ever cross the line?
I love that you brought that up, because that was something I really stuck out to me out of the gateway situation. There's been so many situations now, but I did listen to at least the elder, that was kind of, I guess, the lead elder share that they had let go of multiple people that were in the board or eldership there because they knew enough about Cindy Clemenshire, who was 12 years old.
Yes, she was 12.
She was 12 years old. And they knew enough to have asked the harder questions, to have pursued further investigation. That's negligence as a shepherd.
It is.
Because a shepherd is supposed to be vigilant.
Yep.
They're supposed to say, hey, that's clearly, he's got some red flags. We have to check that out and see what's going on for the sake of, everyone's.
Yeah. Again, that's some of the similarities here. The patterns.
Yeah, I think I've watched too much now. It's not like I haven't gone to like trauma classes in that sense and really learned some of this stuff. I probably could. But I think just hearing so many stories that you start to see the patterns.
Right.
You can't help but.
And especially right now, like with Morningstar, as we're hearing your story and as it ties into Morningstar, I mean, have right now 4 lawsuits, 5th lawsuit, 5 now, 5th lawsuit just came out, all dealing with the negligence of leadership. That, I mean, so many instances of SA that at any point in time, if leaders would have been aware and cared and intervened and done what they should have as leaders, that the harm that could have stopped if they would have done that. And that's just the lawsuits that are brought forward, right? There's all the other cases we've heard. There's Leah's story and the girls who got SA during my time as a student, what you experienced. And then, I mean, there's so many other stories. I just feel like we've barely begun to scratch the surface of just Morningstar. I almost feel like when they talk to you at dinner, there's like this denial. Like there's this denial, like obviously it's my speculation that like maybe they sense something more was going on, but they don't want to acknowledge it when you're right there in front of them, because that would be to have to acknowledge their own failures, that they failed as leaders and they failed you.
Right.
But when leaders acknowledge that, that's part of the healing process, like you were talking about. Not just the person who did the abuse to you, but the people who enabled it by not asking questions, by not seeing what they should see as a leader and as a guide, to the young people around them, or just the people in their flock.
And you actually reached out to them eventually as you were coming forward, is that right? And just
I did. Yeah.
How did that go?
In the process, not as well as I'd hoped. So in the context of coming forward, and I just want to set a little timeline. So I came forward in 2019 is when I first came forward to law enforcement. And that's when I realized like I need to do something here. I disclosed more to my family. And I mentioned that because again, our families are somewhat closely tied together. It wasn't like when I came forward, it was a secret. So I came forward to law enforcement in 2019. The case took a long time because it went through several DAs, and that's a whole other story and on the case side of things. But at one point it felt like it kind of came to a standstill. So I was like about 2 years into that process, and I felt like nothing was happening. And I felt still like I'm responsible. I need to do something. I need to say something. So that's when I decided I'm going to reach out to the church. We're going to reach out to Abide the Vine, and I'm going to draft a letter asking for their help and their assistance. So in this letter, I feel like it was as gracious as possible. It was basically saying that I don't know that you knew at the time that this had happened, but here's what happened to me. And I'm asking for your help in both. It had very specific asks. I'm asking for your help to be part of this healing process with me, because what happened to me didn't just happen to me. It happened within this entire community. Happened within the leadership here at the church. I would love for you to be part of the healing journey with me in this, and part of the process of holding, David Fenton accountable. And I also made a specific ask at that point in time to forward that on to engage Morningstar in this, because I knew that relationship was there and that they were part of that.
They're their covering.
They're the accountability.
Yeah, there's their accountability, right? Yeah. So, and that letter was in July of 2021.
Okay.
I did not receive a response. Now, I will also, and in this, I do want to specify that at that point in time, Pastor Fred Hoover was diagnosed with cancer and was very sick. He was there at that elders meeting. He did sign off on receiving it. But no, Morningstar did not reach out. No one else from the church reached out directly to me. It was silence, right? And then after that, so literally a month later after that letter, and I actually want to go back to the timing of that letter, if I can.
I'm sorry too. I just want to note that you said they did receive it. You had official notice that they had received it.
Yep. So my dad was an elder at the time, right? Yeah, and saying that so I had them because it was an open case, and we were working with small communities, and communities talk and churches talk. I wanted to have, we're talking about NDAs all the time. I basically crafted an NDA basically to say, hey, you've received this letter. You have to use discretion and who you share this information with in a way to protect. I didn't want them tipping off, right? Because I knew there was an active investigation and this person lived in Australia, right? So that's where David Fenton was living at the time. And I didn't want that information to get there first before the investigation was completed. And also wanted to keep the integrity of the investigation, right? Like, so that there is that. And listen, I'm flying blind by this. Like, I'm just a person. I don't have a legal background, right? So anyway, and I'll assure you that the DA's office, actually the PA Attorney General's office, was not happy with me when they found out about the letter. But it thankfully didn't cause any harm. And I still feel like it was the right thing to do. But yeah, it did not get a response. And so it was a month later that the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office took over the case and decided to take it on. So they help when there's extenuating circumstances, when a local district attorney can't manage a case. So they took on the case and then resumed the investigation. So I had given them a list of people that I knew could corroborate my story, people to talk to, people that had been involved, right? So obviously Pastor Fred and Donna Hoover's names were on that list. The Steve Thompson's name, Robin McMillan's name was on, because those are the people that I knew, right, were aware of the relationship. And the investigation was, the investigator was calling. It was December of that time frame, so it was, would have been December of 2022, or December 2021, I guess it would have been. And the investigator called me and told me that they were not able to get in touch. Fred and Donna Hoover did not respond to phone calls, and Steve Thompson did not respond to phone calls either. So they decided not to participate in the investigation, but other family members did. And then Pastor Fred passed. So we still don't know what he knew or what his thoughts were on things. I certainly don't know. And certainly, right, Morningstar never made an official response either.
Yeah.
Yeah, and can I also say what bothers me? So, like, fast forward years later, right? And then when Chris Reed resigned and the story with Catherine came out, I did the timing of that, and my letter was given like that same time frame, a little like a month or two maybe before Catherine was abused by Chris Reed.
So yeah.
And so learning that was huge, like, for me, because I was like, wait, why didn't my letter, right, make it there and have an impact? And then I later found out that maybe the letter never made it to Morningstar.
I was gonna say, I've watched enough of Rick Joyner to believe that I don't think that he wants to receive any such letter. Like, I don't think that he really wants to bring that level of accountability, which is crazy, learning that there's like 400 churches seeking some kind of network of accountability. And it's like, I honestly, as much as I've heard about, and from some of your friends too, the guys that they sort of just kind of, oh, you did bad here, let's push you over here, or we're just going to put you in this ministry over here, but not actually confront any of the wrong you did to God's people.
Right.
And then so they just go on to do it further at some other place, which is why I think like it is so important that you came forward. But I think sometimes people think that we just want somebody to suffer and feel all the pain for the bad, and that just almost like we want to see people fall. And it's like, I think that's such a misconception, because the reality is a lot of times these guys will repeat harm, other children.
Yes.
And it looks like reconnected.
Yes.
And so we're literally like, to not report, to not come forward, to not really fight for accountability, is to put, who knows how
it's to put others at risk.
Yeah, how many more children are going to potentially be harmed, even if it's just one.
Yeah.
And so I think that we really need to take that seriously. Especially in the church.
Actually, when you said that they first kind of sent him off and blessed him onto other ministries, as like you said is very common in these circles. even if they may not have known the SA was going on at that time. I mean, they clearly knew the relationship happened, right? And this is a pattern we've seen specifically at Morningstar. Like, I can attest to this from just my time there. Pastors who were absolutely have been found to be having some sort of, SA or some sort of sexual misconduct. And instead of rebuking them before all and reporting them, if it's, if it, like a crime has happened, they just quietly, fire them, but they bless them in front of the congregation and send them off. And then they literally go on to other ministries. So many of them go on to other ministries. That happened in Leah's case, literally. They blessed him, the pastor, and sent him off. And, we found out he was at a church that we knew of. And it's like, that's what happens when they don't confront this and they don't. It's negligence. It's negligence of leadership. And we've certainly seen that from Morningstar.
It's gross negligence, right? Who does that? I'm sorry. I'm just, this is the part that just drives me so mad. Like, who does that? Who says, I'm aware that there is possibility or there actually is SA here, and yet we're going to not say anything. We're going to cover our brother and let him go do this somewhere else. And so another person gets harmed. That I don't have words for that.
Yeah.
This is where they're culpable in perpetuating harm.
Yes.
And that's really what it is. And people need to start looking at it as, I am caught by not saying something, by not speaking up. I am culpable. I am responsibility. Someone else is harmed. Part of that responsibility is on me, right? That is the truth.
They're intentionally looking away. That's my assessment, is these men, so many of them, they know there's something not right.
Even when they sent Pastor Dave off and blessed him, but here at the dinner table, down the road after it's all broken off, they're like having to acknowledge, oh, he's gone on and tried to mess with other girls and other.
It's kind of mind-boggling that there's not a more serious position from elders in the body. That these spaces are even. I almost feel like they have to be created.
Yeah.
Because there's outlets are needed to be able to process together.
Yeah.
And the church certainly isn't really creating that safe space. I mean, we're seeing it more now.
I think part of it, and if I can speak to that a little bit, certainly, because I've a question that, like, how does one do that? Like, and I think part of it too is that it's really hard to question aspects, right, of our system of belief. And when we have leaders, we do put them on pedestals. We do want to believe everything, and so that they're saying, and we tie a lot of our personal beliefs and beliefs around God and spirituality to leaders and to groups of identification. And that sense of belonging, right? When you have friends, when you have people and community that you've built into it, it's hard then to extract and call things out and say, well, that's not okay, because then it begins a questioning, and that feels very unsettling. It feels very unnerving to call into question certain beliefs, or and that can be really difficult. It can be really difficult to call something out and go against the norm, right? And to be that person that does go against the norm, and that isolation. And so I think God's big enough to handle all of that, right? To sense of questioning, to go that sense of isolation. I think it's essential that we question beliefs and we follow those threads. But I certainly understand people like a certain aspect of certainty. They don't like uncertainty. They don't like to have to be in a place of questioning and thinking. They like things handed to them in nice, tied up places, that this is what we believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's just the aspect too of, like, when we do put these people on pedestals and we just like come to, we almost create a sense of family sometimes around someone that we don't really know.
Yes.
And then so we're like, how dare you say that about Pastor so-and-so? You're an accuser. And they feel personally attacked because you're bringing something up about their beloved leader, and so they take it very personally.
Yes.
We're here, we want to hear your story, but it wasn't just to go through like a chronological timeline of the events. It's like you're sharing what you've learned, what you've gained from that, the perspective that you've come out with on the other side to hopefully help someone else who may be in this situation, or help not even just like SA survivors, but the people who are in these communities who maybe haven't recognized it, or maybe they've had ways they've denied it and they need to kind of come to their own reckoning with that and know, how can I do better for my own children, my community. When did you start to realize that like what you went through was abuse?
It was after I became a mom. And I think part of it had to do with I was doing so much work around shame and healing the shame around that. I mean, it took me at least 20 years. And I think there's something to be said about, like, it takes survivors a long time, right, to come out and to be able to unpack and to reframe it. It was really, I think I had to get to a place of healing where I could handle, right, that aspect of realizing that, yes, this was abuse and it wasn't my fault, right? And to go through that healing journey, which does take a lot of energy and time and work.
It really does.
But yeah,
it's emotionally like very exhausting, having to work through stuff that you're like have just buried. That's kind of the same. I didn't deal with any of my stuff for like 2 decades, right? And so when stuff finally comes up, it's like we got to get through some ugly tears and some, some deep pain, and realizing. I feel like you may have shared. Did you say you were you had been watching something, maybe a documentary, that you just kind of really connected to? Yeah, if you don't mind, share on that. Like,
so I don't mind at all, because for me it was right. I went through that level of like realizing, oh my gosh, this was abuse, this was predatory, getting to the point of realizing that that was never God's will for my life, right? That was never God's intention. That was not a word of the Lord. And coming to that space of healing. And for me, initially, it was, I can handle this. I can heal on my own and in my own private space. Within about probably, I don't know, within 5 years of me first recognizing that, yes, this was abuse, I was watching a documentary called Abducted in Plain Sight. Jan, I can't pronounce her last name right now. I can't think of it. Anyway, Jan, her story. And watching her story, this person was really fixated on her. She was young and he was 100% like focused on getting her to marry him. He was already married, had a family, was someone prominent in their church community. And watching that story unfold, and then decades later, after his relationship with her, he had gone on to abuse other people, even being married, even being this upstanding person in the church community. And when I realized that, I was like, oh, all the things that like he must have been like in my story, David was probably just focused on me. And then realizing, oh, he's married, he has a child, he's in church still, like he's probably not doing, those were the excuses I had given myself. And then realizing like, no, that's not always the case. In fact, predators typically go on to perpetuate and continue to abuse. That's when I was like, I have to come forward. I have to say something. And in fact, my sister might remember the time, because I called her, right? And I was just like, ugly tears, ugly cry, because I had this realization, like, I've been silent for 2 decades. What has happened in the last 2 decades, right? What is on my shoulders, right? And she did a beautiful job of being like, Sarah, like, listen, you were a survivor, you're a victim in this story. You're doing the thing, you're coming forward now. Like, that's not on you. That's not your responsibility. But I certainly still, like, there's still that aspect, right? And that's really why I came forward, was to protect the community at large. Certainly hopeful that no one was ever, like, I would love to be the only person that was ever, victimized by this person. But what if, right, he had gone on and victim. And of course, now we're at the point where there is consequences, right? And he's being held accountable. And the community is safe, right? Like, he cannot go on and perpetuate this harm anymore. And that feels really good. But there's also, and this is why I come on and have these conversations, and why I'm willing to publicly speak about what happened to me. Because it is not easy. But it's because I want other people to be safe, right? I want others to know these kind of patterns, to know the intricacies of my story so that they can apply that to their own lives, so that they know what to look for. Survivors know that they're not alone in this journey, and that advocates know the important role they play, and like platforms like you know the important role you play. And it is critical to share these stories. And I think I had told you guys before, you know, that I really value the work that you do, because raising these stories and bringing this in the light is really incredibly important. It brings that call to action in the community. It helps hold people accountable.
I guess I just realized how many predators get away from law enforcement.
Yeah.
They're never brought to justice through law enforcement.
Oh my gosh.
But I feel like there's so many
Yes.
daughters and sons that could be vindicated if they really had a family of God to embrace them. And
well, that's exactly what like Sarah was seeking when she reached out to her church.
Yeah, you were really reaching out.
I read that letter. I was so impressed reading your letter, because I just thought how much it spoke to your character as a person, because here you are, you're the one who went through this abuse. You're the one who was overlooked by your entire community and by your leaders and everyone around you. And yet you're the one inviting them to be a part of the healing process. Like it spoke so much of your person, your character. Like that's not a bitter person. That's not a person who's just has a vendetta. You're like, hey, you guys are the community I grew up in. We went through this. I'm inviting you to take ownership of this and to take accountability, and then to heal and learn from it. And then, I mean, what a sentiment that was not received, you know. And I think they really missed out. They missed out on being a part of that with you, because I look at you and I see like how much you've healed coming through this, and you've gone, you know, survivor to you're advocate now, and now you're speaking up and you're helping others by telling your story. And so I feel like they missed out a lot. But you know, you have brothers and sisters now, I hope you know that, who are a part of this with you, even as much as you've come through healing maybe, but that, you know, like you're helping and impacting other people now, just sharing your story.
Well, I think I shared with you even in an email, right? Like, just the way that you responded back to me, which you're always so kind and gracious, and you validated the story as I'm like giving you some notes and highlights and stuff, and I said to you, like, it's every time I would like share part of my story, I'm waiting for someone to be like, oh, that doesn't matter, or that's, you know, get over it. I don't know, just some kind of dismissal, right? I'm expecting there to be a dismissal, or even no response, right? And when you come back with, oh my goodness, I'm so sorry that has happened to you, you know, that was not okay, right? That confirmation, and even anytime I've spoken with attorneys, right, who have responded that way, it is incredibly validating, right? To hear like, yes, like your story matters, and that should not have happened to you. As much as I've healed, and as much work as I've done, like every time I hear that, it validates that. And you think about it, I've had 20 plus years, right, of invalidation, right? And a lot of foundational invalidation of my experience, and silencing. So to hear the validation now, to bring this out into the open, it certainly is healing.
I think that's such a important point too for others, because like you said, it's like you're expecting people to dismiss it or maybe doubt it or question you. And I think that's the culture that's been created, and certainly in the church and these settings. And I think it's also outside of the church, you know, where we kind of have this taboo around bringing up, you know, sexual abuse. And we have learned, well, people are going to question me, people are going to doubt me. But that's why it's so important right now, like when we make room for people to come and share their story, like we're here to listen to you, not to, we're not here to investigate you and question you. Like when you come forward, it took so much for you to get to that place. And so when we create that space for others, I can't even imagine the number of the victims that haven't come forward yet. All the stories we've been hearing, we're inundated with the exposure that's happening in the church, but there's still so many that haven't come forward yet. And I hope that any who are listening might be encouraged that there is people who support you. There is brothers and sisters who will come alongside you and stand with you as you share your story, and as we try to bring accountability to people who should no longer be in positions of leadership over others. And that's when you shared that you watched that documentary. I think you might have stepped out of the room for that, but she had watched documentary that was very similar to her story.
Some about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it stuck out to me. I think we had it in our conversation, maybe even before we we jumped on here, that you saw yourself in that story. You're like, wow, that's like there's similarities here, and I recognize I'm seeing myself in this story. And I think that's why it's so powerful to speak up and to share your story, because we have seen that over and over again. Even just recently, it's like Jane Doe came out, Deborah Perkins came out with her story, and then Tammy Woods realizes, oh my gosh, it wasn't just me, it happened to somebody else, and it kind of creates that effect. And same like with you, you're listening to someone else,
like Catherine. And you were listening.
You saw Catherine, and I think even Jane Doe also, she was watching a documentary and she saw herself in that story and realized, oh my gosh,
she did.
And that's why I think it's so powerful.
Yeah, with Bill Cosby.
I'm realizing too, there's people that are, I guess, just becoming aware of some of these issues and stuff. So like the Catherine thing, that was Wake Up and Win. So just to give them
shameless plug for Blaze and Christina, their channels also. Yeah, go watch them.
I'm sure a lot of people probably already realized that story, but there's some that won't.
Yeah.
And it was basically another pastor at Morningstar,
Chris Reed, the prophet guy.
She was such a sweet spirit.
Yeah,
Catherine was, and I don't know. I was kind of upset in some of the commenter people that just like coming at her.
Again, coming against her.
Who do you think you are? You're not a victim. You're not this. It's like.
There's such a, and can we talk about that? I mean, I know that so many other podcasters, right, and in this space talk about that. It's that power dynamic, right? And certainly within my case, we have the age difference, which was a power dynamic. But then when you have someone that is positioning themselves as someone that hears from God, that is in spiritual authority over them, there's power dynamic there that doesn't allow for consent. So it doesn't matter what age someone is at in that space. That when you do use your position of power and authority, right, to then prey on someone's vulnerability or their openness. In this case, a lot of times it's openness to God, openness to spirituality, openness to it's an exploitation, and that is spiritual abuse. No, Catherine is not in those cases, right? And in all of those, it's funny because you reframe all these things where you hear old stories of pastors that had affairs, or and then that person, the person that they had an affair with, the pastor, right, an affair, is labeled a Jezebel or a stumbling block, or labeled all these things, the temptress. No, that we have to change that view. That is not the correct view. Look at the person that has power. Look at the person that's holding all of that position, right? Where is the imbalance of power there? And so no, it's not that. And we need to change the church culture around those kinds of descriptions. We need to start seeing the power dynamics for what they are, and recognizing that, and people in those positions need to have respect for those power dynamics and honor that, and know how to protect that. Have responsibility, right? There has to be a level of responsibility and awareness around that power dynamic, instead of just blatantly using it and abusing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, and like you said, that's what they're taking advantage of, the trust that we're having for these ones who are supposed to be our leaders, who are supposed to be our spiritual guides. I think something this has also been showing us, even to just, take it a step further than just recognizing those power dynamics, is that these leaders in most cases have too much power. Like biblically, they're not even supposed to have that level of power, and just where they're calling the shots, and they don't have anyone that they're accountable to except for people that they pay for their salary.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like they're yes men. And so biblically, we see elders, and we see a multitude of people in a community, not where it's just kind of this one or couple people who have all the power.
Say, like, I mean, like, back to that accountability, right? Like, people have too much power and there has to be this level of accountability. Why, that was the whole point. I mean, as a kid growing up in the church, that was the whole point, I thought, that Morningstar was to a church like Abide in the Vine, was to provide that accountability, that checks and balance and power, right? And in this case, that didn't happen.
They failed. Yeah, they absolutely failed, even though to this day, they still are the accountability head over Abide.
But it's easier to point the finger at the people that are bringing it forward. It's almost like they treat you as the you're the problem. Like you become the embodiment of the problem, even though you were a victim to it.
Yeah.
And like the practicality of where Jesus said, if you seek to be a leader, then you're the servant of all.
The conversations about the essay and the double lives of the pastors is helping us recognize how did we ascribe this much power to these pastors and these ministers that are now then living these double lives with no accountability. And I think that because we haven't held them accountable, because we haven't had the right structure of leadership that we should have, it's honestly been an enticing thing to become a pastor today. You get to be like the superstar. You get to have everybody adore you and love you. You get to get rich. And if you mess up and you go, cheat on your wife or you essay somebody, the church will cover it up for you. It's fine. You can just move on. Or worst case scenario, they're going to bless you and move you on to another ministry. Not many people, I feel like, have had the right motives, especially in this charismatic space where we see it over and over and over again.
If you have any kind of aspect of charisma and you can create you can have presence on stage, right? That's what typically ends up becoming a leader within these church realms versus really being a shepherd, being a father, being, that person that's going to take care of their community. And that's, I don't understand how we got so far away from the community aspect. How can you have true community, true fellowship, true relationship with each other in these structures that are so super, these mega churches that are, and cultures that are so big, you just can't. Certainly not to the point of the way that I think the original church was meant to be.
Absolutely,
right?
Yeah.
And like, how can you have deep connection and fellowship if you don't share your hearts with one another? That's the part I never understood. Like, the fellowship became, hey, shake the neighbor.
And they tell us to shake our neighbor's hand. But like you said, that structural setup, it's impossible to do that when we all just come and sit down and just listen to one person and a few select people sing. That's not us having fellowship, and like you said, how did we get so far from what we see was established by the apostle? I wanted to ask you too, if you don't mind sharing. I know we kind of already got to when you came forward and when you filed these charges, and that was a long process in itself, like you said, the investigation, everything. But he just had his conviction, and this was just about a month ago. But you actually had to go and testify at some point, right?
I did, yeah. So I had to testify at the preliminary hearing, which was a whole experience. I don't wish that on anyone. That was the first time that I had seen him in person, and I had to answer a lot of questions, kind of share my story in a court of law, right? Where they have very specific questions in order to classify whether certain statutes, right, were what happened specifically, so they know how to tie that to specific criminal activity, right? So it's very detailed. It's really difficult to go back into those memories, and even in a civil case. So just so everyone understands, again, in a civil case, you're going through a lot of the same scenarios, right, where you're having to detail, and not just for, in my case, not just for the prosecution side, but then the defense can counter. Apologize. I have a puppy here. That's a little.
That's okay.
But yeah, you have a lot of pieces here that that you have to go through in detail, and so you have to go through these memories that never in any other space do you ever have to go through this, right? In therapy, you're not going through these detailed experiences. In conversation with friends and family, you're not having to go through such detailed conversations. So it's a difficult journey. So yeah, I did have to do it. I did it. I'm so proud of myself for doing it. It was worth it. But I know it's not something that I would want anybody else to have to go through either.
Right.
Yeah, well, we're proud of you for doing it too.
Yeah.
Because I know that is hard. Just relive the trauma, in detail to go through those things. I really can't imagine on that level. It's like you said, when you're just sharing with friends and family and even counselors, you really don't dive into your specific trauma details. So that's really hard, and all the more like why we need to be supportive. But I just think about that, like you being brave to do that and face that, the harm that it can stop from that going on and happening, you know, because I don't know if we mentioned this yet, but he was essentially on the run, right? And he was kind of in Australia and they couldn't apprehend him.
There's some pieces there that I'm not real clear on. So he had left the United States shortly after the relationship with me ended, and ended up going to Australia, marrying someone there and establishing his ministry there, right up until charges were filed. And then I think in Australia did the right thing and probably separated themselves from him at that point. And then the way that he was apprehended was, and just so you know, there's like a lot of things that happen, and I kind of think it's a little bit miraculous that the whole thing did happen, because there are so many pieces to it, that when you seek extradition, there's a lot of other agencies that have to get involved, and there's a whole process, there's a lot of paperwork, everything has to be tightened up and buttoned up beautifully, and that took a while, almost 2 years, right? And so an Interpol note, I had gotten the notification that the Interpol notice had been filed, and which is the first part, right? And then Australia could have then helped after the Interpol notice had been filed. But what happened in between that was he decided to travel to the Philippines. And so when he traveled, because the Interpol notice had been already filed, it got flagged when he hit the Philippines. They saw what the charges were, and then handed him directly over to the United States. So he got stopped right at the border of the Philippines, and then U.S. Marshals, he flew back to the United States with U.S. Marshals, and then was arrested immediately and put in jail at L.A. County, and then was extradited. He had to be extradited from L.A. to Pennsylvania, where then he had to be processed, and then where he stood, where we did the prelim trial. I certainly understand there were moments in the whole process, and I think I hear stories often with survivors that go through the judicial system that a lot of times they give up right in the process, and it's just a brutal process. Yeah. And so at that point they're like, this is too much, it's costing me too much, and they will stop. And I certainly got to a point where I was like, I don't know that I can keep moving forward with this. I don't know that the cost is worth it. And thankfully I had a lot of good, family support and advocates that were there that could encourage me to keep going. And, when I was done, they kind of helped carry the torch a little bit for me. And I don't have any regrets right now of continuing moving forward. But it certainly costs. I want people to know, like, it cost a lot. It cost me a lot. It cost my family a lot. It cost my kids a lot. Like, the toll it takes on, the family. I'm gone. I'm doing, different things. I'm going to therapy. I'm, not always present. I'm having to manage a lot of emotions. The trauma kind of recreates and reliving in it. And my kids have carried the brunt of that. And
where when you realized just that these predators usually have more than one victim, right? Statistically, they have more than one victim. And even hearing from your pastors when they sat you down that time after the relationship ended, that you're hearing kind of hints about it, and then it's like, oh, well, we can't talk about it. And so it's like, it is very likely that this guy went on to, potentially harm others and in another country even, where they don't know about it. They don't know about what he did here in the United States. And so I think that is part of why, like, it's so important to address it when we see it, because otherwise it'll keep going on, and passing on sometimes into multiple generations.
Yes, and that's why even in an organization like Morningstar, right, which is a global organization, right, they have churches and affiliates across, globally. That's where, for us to create change, there has to be a level of responsibility. So what should have happened and what needs to happen is when there is a pastor that is predatory or a minister that's predatory and the organization is aware of it, they then tell the rest of the organization, right? If someone moves to another country, that they inform the new churches, right? That, hey, just so you know, this is what happened, we're aware of this. Not continue to allow other people just to freely move about the world and perpetuate harm. We need to stop that. We need to have protocols in place and safety nets in place.
Absolutely. And I mean, honestly, just put in perspective too for others who aren't as familiar with Morningstar. So in your case, Pastor Dave got a conviction, right? So the youth pastor, he got a conviction.
Yeah.
He's actually serving a sentence.
Yeah.
And we also know of Erickson Lee, who was the youth leader at the church in Fort Mill, who's also behind bars right now for SA of multiple victims, multiple victims over multiple years. Yes. And I just feel like this should cause people to pause right now to realize that Morningstar has under its belt 2 youth pastors, 2 youth leaders who were convicted of being offenders against underage kids. I mean, that should raise some questions, and that's not even bringing up the other people that haven't been filed. Like you said, not everybody wants to file the charges because it's so much to go through.
Story, for instance.
Yeah.
The other, he was a youth pastor as well.
Right? Yeah. He was our student pastor, and like she said, there's 30 some women in the room. And that's just the ones that showed up. And so, how much has this gone on? I mean, I'll share this with you too, because when you put it in perspective, it's like, I just put down a little list of all the people that we know of that Morningstar has platformed who have had SA allegations, confirmed SA, or who have been literally convicted.
Publicly outed.
And even dating back to the 80s, it's like we have Kevin Prosh, we have Bob Jones, we have Paul Kane, we have David Fenton, we have Steve Thompson. There was, in his case, he was fired abruptly and they didn't tell us why, but the meeting that Leah was at, Rick said he was fired for the same sexual conduct that the other student pastor was.
And you heard from others too, it was common knowledge essentially about the affair, and at least in another class.
Right? I'll say allegedly because that was what students shared who were, in classes before me. But again, they don't tell us anything. When they do get rid of people, they don't tell you why they get rid of people. And then we had Stephen Alls. We had another youth pastor who was crossing lines. We had Brad McClendon. We have Todd Bentley, one of the oh my gosh, not just at Morningstar, but the harm that he has caused in the church in so many places. Yes. And then we go on, we have Erickson Lee and Chris Reed, and I'm like, gosh, this is just the ones we know of. These are the ones we know of. If people don't see that there is a systemic problem of platforming predators at Morningstar, it's because they don't want to see, and they're blind. I don't really know what else to say with like the evidence that's there.
The tree by its fruit. You have to, because Christ taught us to do so. And if you see this much, like, just rotten
bad fruit.
I also want to make it very clear to people that in so many places and states, there are not legal avenues that are open for people, right? There's a statute of limitations in every state. Every state has a different statute of limitations because I was able to do it in Pennsylvania because their statute of limitations is so open. Yeah. I still reported to New York because he lived in New York and SA happened in New York as well, but the statute of limitations isn't open for that there. Same goes for civil. On the civil side, every state is different. Sometimes it's the age of you have a certain amount of time as the victim to come forward, and that's constantly changing, and I hope that continues to change with states and making changes to that. But for so many people, there's not a legal recourse, and it's not fair for their stories to not matter as much because there's no legal recourse. Absolutely. Right? There shouldn't have to be this validation of, well, he's now in prison or this place was sued. Stories should matter regardless.
I love that you say that.
Yes.
And that is powerful coming from you. Because you've been, there was a time where you didn't have a conviction, and you still, he was still just as guilty.
Yep.
He was still just as culpable. I've felt that a lot, as far as some of the pushback to this space,
They're like, let the police figure it out. Don't speak to it until there's an official investigation.
And it's like, that's not at all that's not how Scripture reads at all.
Yeah.
For how we're to handle dealing with matters of justice and speaking up for those that are in the oppressed.
Well, and I don't know what your thought was, but growing up in the church, I always thought the whole aspect of separation of church and state was that the church was always going to live at a higher standard, right? That they were always going to maintain. doing more than. They're going to go above and beyond in the acts of, making sure things are just. And in fact, we're seeing exactly the opposite, right? This whole aspect of Morningstar choosing to invoke separation of church and state in order to then throw out all of these claims with these boys. That's just, it makes me like speechless. And it's funny because in New York State, there was a period of time that you could come forward. And so I did consult with a couple of attorneys regarding Morningstar, regarding Abide in the Vine. And they came back with, after reviewing, and I had quite a few well-known attorneys looking at this, they came back with, we can't take this on. We're likely to get hit with, the church can claim separation of church and state. They can claim their religious freedom. And because you were 14 at the time, in their eyes, they can say that you were already married, therefore it's not SA. And because it didn't contradict with the state minimum age at that point, they have a case to go forward with that defense. And that was why I wasn't able to pursue a civil suit in New York State at that time. 14. And it's just crazy. Yeah, because I was like, in Pennsylvania, it was legal at the time to get married. So then the church was basically going to be able to claim like a good defense attorney would then say, well, in our eyes, religious freedom, she was already married.
It was legal to get married at 14.
I know. I'm like, what state is it legal
in?
Actually,
you should look into that. There's a lot of, that's the other aspect of advocacy. There's a lot of states that had really low ages. It's now since changed, but back then it was legal at 14.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and there's actually still states out there that have really low ages. You can be a child and get married.
I almost feel like it's partly a vindication for you too then, that the boys' lawsuit, that's the very thing they claimed.
Yes, I want to call that judge up and go, yes.
I know, but we prayed for like a righteous judge and somebody, even, I don't know what his personal beliefs are, but you can see this plainly for what it is, because that's the very thing they try to claim. So those attorneys saw rightly that they'll try to do that. Like, we have clergy privilege, right?
Yep.
And the judge said, nope.
Yep. Nope. Not here. Yep.
You had actually said something to me in our email when I, reached out to you after I realized that, that Fenton had been convicted. And it was just so encouraging and so powerful to me. I was like, I feel like other people should hear this, because there's so many people speaking into this space right now who just care. There's no like ulterior motives. There's no like, I'm trying to get clicks or likes or money. Like,
you're gonna be a YouTube star off of like the church.
Church
like we're not coming to be like the big rock stars on the stage. We're talking to people.
But you said that while the legal action is one avenue to pursue, it's really been people speaking up that has been making an impact. It's been making a difference. So I don't know if you have like anything that you'd want to share on that, just encouraging like those of us who are speaking up and who are trying to advocate for victims coming forward and for survivors.
Yeah, I absolutely firmly believe that it is that like platforms like yours that are highlighting these stories that's making the biggest impact, right? Because it creates that conversation. Anytime there's a news piece or blurb, right, it gets passed around, right? People text it to each other, even if they're not sharing it like through their stories or, on social media, they're sharing it amongst their families, and it's creating the conversation, right? And I know it, even in my own story, I'm really familiar with my story, and yet it still like created more conversation. It brought up more things, and I think it's helping facilitate the really hard conversations that wouldn't normally happen. This isn't something that you sit down at your dinner table and then just suddenly bring up, right? This is something that you're hearing about, that then you dive into the conversation, but they're necessary conversations, and change isn't going to happen unless we have these conversations. Like if you guys understand how important this kind of platform is, like even when I was in the legal space, right, and told not to talk about it, so many of like the civil attorneys that I consult, Boz, I don't know if you're familiar with that name. He used to be part of Grace, and now he's separate. But so Boz knows my story really well, and he did a lot of consulting. for me. And so he had said, he was, get on whatever, get this to the media, get on whatever podcasting you can, because that pressure, right? It's the conversation, it's the cultural pressure that really creates some of that change and puts pressure to make there be accountability, and that's what happens, right? And I think that these conversations are so important. And like I said to Erica when we were having that conversation, I don't know that we're going to change someone like Rick Joyner's mind or Mike Bickle's mind. I don't know that they'll see the truth at some point, but we do have the power to help the people that are following, that are questioning, that are participating in these spaces, so that they know what it looks like, what it sounds like, so that they can call it out, so that they can protect themselves, so they can also make the decision as to whether or not they're going to continue to fund, certain organizations that aren't responding appropriately, that aren't protecting and aren't implementing safe spaces and safe protocols for the people that are part of their communities. They're not creating safe communities. So I think that this is hugely important, and what you guys are doing and sharing these platforms and putting this out there at the risk of your own reputations, and you guys hearing all of the things and the slander and all the negative comments, it's so powerful and it's so impactful, and you guys are truth tellers. It matters and it makes a big difference. I know it's mattered in my own community. I know that it's had conversation. I hope this continues to have conversation. I know people have reached out to me after hearing various stories or reading stories or hearing podcasts and saying, oh, I need to connect with you on that and I need to have conversation. And for me, it's even developed a better community, right, of healing. And I hope that happens for other survivors, other people who have experienced SA. And if you didn't, and you're hearing this, podcast, and you can be one of those people that can have that conversation with others and help validate their story and help bring change, right? And help demand change, right? The community has power here. Where you put your money matters, and where you put your voice and where you advocate, that matters. So use that power to create safe environments and to create change.
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. And I would like anybody who is affiliated, maybe they're part of an MFM church or ministry, or someone who is, encourage these people to
take it seriously.
Demand change, to use your position to call on Rick Joyner, to say these are not people who are just have an agenda to take down the church or take down Morningstar, Rick Joyner. We've just seen too much. There's too much evidence for us to unsee and unhear, that we have to say something. And so I would just encourage anyone else who has any ties to that or affiliation to speak up and say something. And if there's no change, withdraw your support from it. Withdraw your support. Don't be a member anymore. I think we've done it a certain way for so long that it's awkward, it's uncomfortable for people. And like you said, it's like we have to have these conversations, and these conversations are uncomfortable for people.
You require that. You have to bring your heart to the table. And
you mentioned something that I felt like was a good note too, that though you went through therapy and counseling, just kind of dealing with this, right? And you recognize that was good, and it helped you in the healing journey. But you also said that, if you could share on that?
Yeah. Because right, and I love therapy. I'm a big proponent of therapy. I'm a big proponent of EMDR for trauma treatment. It was really great, right? All those things were great, but that's in isolation. That's my story, and it's me and one therapist, right? It's different when it's community-based. Community-based healing is I don't even know that I have words. I'm gonna try to fumble around and find words, but there's an aspect of community healing that is so different. It takes a whole level of shame. It takes away that isolation, and it really brings you back into a place of a sense of belonging, a sense of wholeness, that harm that was created, because the SA is one of those experiences that really does cut you off from your community, from that secrecy, the secrecy and the shame really isolates you. Whether or not you know that it's intentionally happening, it just does. And so when you can come back into this sense of community, it heals in an entirely different way. And I don't know that I have perfect words to describe that experience, but it is next level healing in that sense of community. There's an organization called Reclamation Collective And a lot of what they focus on is helping those that have been harmed in a spiritual context. So in the religious spaces, in spiritual spaces, a lot of various churches, and to be honest with you, so many people have also endured SA in that experience. So yeah, I'm a volunteer as the chair of the board, and then kind of jump it. I mean, I do a lot of work around helping survivors kind of navigate that.
I think it's important to start to really define and know. I don't know. Sometimes people are speaking past each other.
Language, like I think you even mentioned this in a conversation along the way. It might have been one of our side conversations about having to develop language, right, for some of the things that we're experiencing and navigating, and that certainly has happened. And I think there's been a lot of studies within the religious abuse, religious trauma, kind of spiritual abuse spaces to really help define some of this languaging so that we can have better conversations around it, right?
So I think that's important.
Yeah.
I think that we've seen enough that Rick has not steered his ship well. For there to be this many cases of abuse and people who have been harmed in his flock and under his umbrella, whether it's directly at the Fort Mill Church or at one of their MFM member churches. I think it's enough evidence to say that he has not been doing a good job leading, and so
he just platformed Todd Bentley by accident.
Yeah, by accident.
Big accident.
Yeah.
To just put the guy in.
I'm not sure how that happened, but
and those of us who are drawing attention to it and saying, hey, this happened at your church. My friend was SA'd. I was SA'd. Whoever is coming forward,
you haven't even dealt with the SA cases that are at your door, and you're putting somebody on the stage.
Rick had even said, I think early on when this first a year ago maybe, about how fine, bring on the lawsuits, we're insured, it's fine. Just that blasé attitude of we really don't care. And I want to say, where do you think that money is coming from? The people, and so I kind of want to appeal to the people that are still participating and still, financially backing Morningstar. Whoa, where is your money going? You are funding this. What more evidence do you need? That I would caution anyone, don't continue to fund this until there are protocols, until there are changes, until there is accountability here.
And we hear the response, like you said, going from just kind of saying, discrediting the victims and saying they're outrageous, they're outright lies. And
I couldn't believe it. I remember early on what you're talking about now, when the young boys were coming out. I was beside myself. I said, if this were my sons, I cannot imagine I would be there. Rick, say it to my face. You
gotta look at it like it happened.
We treat each other like that. We need to treat it as best as we can. That's my sister. That's my brother. My mother.
He's obviously gone from disparaging the victims and saying statements like that to now, calling us part of the Antichrist.
He's really stepped it up.
Now people have heard your story. They know what you walked through and how your leadership at your church failed you. Morningstar's leadership failed you. And you still reached out and you wrote this letter in sincerity. And I think it would be actually great for other people to see that too. And they always want to, hang us on Matthew 18, right? You guys aren't going through the right process. It's well, you sent it. You did it. And so they wouldn't respond. So we'll share it with the church now, okay?
Yes. Speaking of Matthew 18, you have got to listen to that podcast that just came out with Randy Hood, that interview with Eric from Preacher Boys, because he addresses how wrong, right, that Matthew 18 teaching. And actually Eric does too. He had another conversation with a previous guest about that teaching. And so they really hit that. That scripture is so misused.
There's a lot of theological things that need to be confronted too.
It's certainly the weaponization of scripture, the manipulation of scripture. That's part of the spiritual abuse aspect.
It is.
I think that as we talked about, so many of us had that response to when these lawsuits came forward from these young boys who experienced this at Morningstar multiple years. I think that was what spurred so many of us to speak up, because just the way he disparaged the victims coming forward and disparaged their story and discredited them, from the get-go.
I was I need to see you in sackcloth and ashes kind of feeling what, not
literally, but maybe literally. I don't know. Y'all do weird stuff there anyway. They always
but not only that, yeah, their night capes. Oh my gosh! Don't get me started on their weird stories.
Oh, we all have a lot of weird stories we could share. We need a special decompression session over all the weird.
No, me and Eric.
This stuff that was lorded over you, as like this is the spiritual way. And when you look at it as you're older and you've matured and even studying the scriptures yourself, you're like, this is so whack. This is not how it's supposed to be.
It's so whack.
Like I told him, I studied the Bible so much more before I was a student than when I was a student at Morningstar. And I was like, I thought the point was I'm supposed to learn from these guys. What I noticed is when Rick, in addition to Rick Joyner disparaging the victims coming forward, he'd use these half-twisted scriptures, never really actually speak it forward, read it in context, never actually open his Bible. He would just say, well, the Bible says X, Y, and Z, and people are just like taking it in, like that's the truth. And we're like, I'm gonna fact check you right now. I'm gonna pull this verse up and tell you that you're lying and you're deceiving people, and that's part of the spiritual manipulation.
Like we showed some.
We showed some of that,
but we haven't given our mind for years and years to make it a serious way. Maybe we'll see him in a headline, but I didn't take him seriously when he took Todd Bentley seriously. And so for me, even listening to him and his thought process, I'm like, who is taking you seriously?
There's still some people there that I'm just like, and I think you realize they're still in it. They're still so up close to it that they're not seeing stuff like we talked about that should be usual red flags going off, that this is not normal, this should not be happening inside of ministry. It's what we're seeing happen, with IHOP and all these places, that when you're still right up close to it and you're not willing to distance yourself from how you held maybe that leader in esteem, or the theology that you've been under from that place, like the spiritual parameters that you had in that organization.
In any kind of high control, religious space, there is that, we're going to build that separation from you, from the rest of the world. And usually it's because you're set apart, you're the holy group, right? But really what it's doing is cutting off all of the external communication, so you can't critically think, you can't get extra sources of information, and then they have complete control over the narrative, complete control over kind of the way that you think, right? And that creates that culture of that brainwashing, that full indoctrination, and they have control.
Yeah, and then what we're seeing now is that when things do start to come out, and you start to have this outcry from the outside community, people who have left and who are finally sharing their stories, they're once again using more prophetic manipulation to weaponize the people that are still there. In Morningstar, we see this where they're like, this is what Rick prophesied so long ago in his Harvest book. He said that Christians were going to turn against Christians, and we're seeing the same thing that we saw at IHOP just take place. How Mike Bickle prepared everybody. This is the black horse prophecy he's been talking about all these years, and that's what he's used to keep people from not talking. Because if you talk about it, if you try to bring accountability, you're gossiping, you're slandering, and you're part of the black horse spirit, and so they all use these things.
And I'm sorry, I'm just gonna throw this out there. I don't know if we'll use it, but I'm tired of hearing about this Leviathan spirit they've been talking about for over 10 years at Morningstar. They bring in Cindy Jacobs to speak on the Leviathan spirit, and Todd Bentley's gonna tell us about Leviathan. Steve Thompson, was he the Leviathan guy?
He was the Leviathan guy. Did you ever hear about this?
There's this word, right, where we over-spiritualize something. We create more spirituality, assign more spirituality to something than what it should be. You turn your brain off, right? You hyper-spiritualize something, and then you turn the brain off, and you stop thinking for yourself. Or
you interpret it through that filter. Oh yeah, this bad thing because the Leviathan's after me, and because I'm speaking up.
If people bringing forth real credible allegations and stories of abuse of people, abuse of power, and manipulation, if they're bringing these things up and seeking accountability and for change to happen, if that's what they call demonic, we're not reading the same Bible. You have just put in so many good exhortations and encouragements to why we have to speak up, because things aren't going to change if we don't have these uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
And it reminded me of the Dr. Seuss quote, that from the Lorax. Yeah, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not. Yeah. And I just feel like that's just the heart of like what you've been sharing, and what so many of us have been saying, is that contrary to what they say, we don't want to tear down the church. In fact, we want to see the church in its full glory and in reformation, and brothers and sisters dwelling together in unity, and getting rid of the corruption and abuse and manipulation that's taking place in the hierarchy structures that are not really what God put in place for the church. Yeah. Of course, yes, we have leaders and we have elders, but what we talked about, like the rock star celebrity mentality that we have created, I believe God is stripping that out of the church. And so much of that has been coming through these conversations. We're like, wait a minute, we've idolized these men and not seen stuff that we should have seen that is wrong, and it's unbiblical, and it's caused harm.
Yes, and I've been through other survival things. I've lost 2 of my brothers.
Oh, wow. I'm sorry. So sorry.
One died and one in a car accident. Yeah, thank you. And so a lot of people will say, you've been through so much. How do you, get through it? And it's, I have no other choice, right, but to survive this. Like you keep walking. You just put one foot in front of the other. You just take the next right step. You find your way through the darkness. There's nothing special, I don't think, about it. There's not, I don't tend to, or spiritually, there's not some special mantle. It's just, this is,
we've so enjoyed just talking to you and having this conversation.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it too. I also say that that's been healing when you're harmed within the church, at least my experience of being harmed in the church. I have so many guards up when it comes to anybody meeting other people from church spaces, right? And because you just don't know. And so this has been really healing for me to be able to have this conversation and share in this space. And you guys have been so lovely and amazing. And you've made me feel very safe and comfortable. And thank you. I'm a loss for words, but I don't know. I can't really elaborate on that feeling of not trusting other people from church communities, but I
talk about this with my friends from school. We struggle because it's not a bitterness. It's not a bitterness.
Not that at all. It's a concern.
It's a concern.
No, it's a concern. Yeah. It's self-protective. I've been hurt. I don't, and I'm going to do extra due diligence.
Tells us to do that. It's important.
Yes.
I second that, even though I feel like it's been healing for me, even though mine didn't happen inside of the church context. But just being able to talk with other people who have been through that and share with openly, because like you said, when you're talking to a therapist or even one-on-one, I've been able to work through all that with my spouse, being able to talk about it in a community sense, friends and peers and brothers and sisters that create an environment. I hope that all of us can create an environment that people just like you would feel that way too. That's such an encouragement to me that you feel that way. And I felt the same. Having this conversation with you has just been so great. And I feel like I've made a friend now, and I'm just so thankful that you came on and talked with us. It's not okay that this stuff is happening, and that it's happening in churches.
For another young lady like yourself that is going to go to that school.
Yeah.
And maybe not have all the sight, but just maybe a few friends, and they're spiritual there.
Yeah, because they still have the school going, and it's I think that's a good point. Thinking back to 19-year-old me and my friends who were 19, and we left our families and our home church to go to this place, and then it's my friends are there. It was dangerous. My friends are essayed by the pastor who's supposed to be leading us, and then other people are too, and it's just whoa, this is rampant. This is a pervasive problem here, There's so much evidence that's come out. I feel like your story coming out, the ones we've heard, and there's more to come, So I just think that's part of that public pressure, like you talked about, that we're not okay with this. I don't know what's going to play out in the legal system, but us as a community in the church, we're not okay with what's happening at your church, at your house. For anybody who isn't aware, we had a petition that was started by a former student after the lawsuits came out of the young boys who were essayed continually over multiple years by the youth leader who's now convicted and serving time in prison. And she started that petition calling for change in Morningstar, calling for accountability, calling for Rick to resign because his leadership has been shown negligent over multiple years and multiple cases that have come forward. It really has extended beyond just Morningstar. I think she's at like 500 signatures now. It started as a lot of us former students and staff, and it really has grown and taken life of its own. And now it's beyond just that. It's people outside of Morningstar that are supporting this, putting their name forward and signing to. They need a third party investigation. They need policy changes that this kind of stuff doesn't happen. And so we've signed that. Sarah's signed that. We've signed it. And so I just want to encourage others to sign that petition as well, and to support that outcry for change and accountability at Morningstar. So I'm going to link that petition into the description. And I just encourage everyone to sign that and show that we don't want this to happen in our churches anymore. We want our churches to be safe for our families and our children to come to.
Yes. I'm sorry. I
Yeah.
just felt like an amen church moment.
Yeah.
Yes. Like, we want to take a stand for righteousness and truth.
And even anyone who's signed before, and the one who that I did put in Leah's, like I was sharing, because I think that was before a lot of information had come out, and maybe some people were still unsure. I can get behind an investigation, but I don't really know about Rick's leadership, but that's kind of a iffy, calling on a leader, a pastor to resign. But I mean, we've shown, it's been plainly evidenced what he's said in public, how he's been denying, any liability and any wrongdoing, and no accountability from leadership, and just the stories that have come out of harm. And so I just encourage anyone, even who signed that one, to sign this petition as well now. Put your support behind that as well, because we need change to happen if we want this to be a place that can actually thrive and there be good leaders in it.